Okay, I've moved you guys all over to the side. But those of you who've been on these trainings before know that if you want to say anything, all you need to do is unmute your mic and feel free to jump in. This is a bit of a long training. I've extended the time to 12:30 just to make sure that we have time to get through it. And I'd like to welcome the people from the GAL's office who asked if they could come. We're happy to have you. I need to make sure that I haven't eliminated anybody. We're happy to have you guys come. Sandy asked me if you could come in. We do a lot of expressive therapies with our kids because a lot of our kids are quite young. So we do a lot of, when I say expressive therapies, I mean play therapies. So usually at the beginning of every year, we start our trainings with the effects of trauma on brain development and why children act the way they do after they have been subjected to traumatic events, and not the least of which is removing them from their homes. So in order for us to try to work with them effectively, we have to help them feel safe. So the job of expressive therapies really is to help children regain that sense of safety. And because they're little, we can't do a lot of talking to them until we have kind of moved through some of this. So I would also say to the GALs, I know that Sandy's purpose in having you come in was to just have you have some exposure to the way we do our work. It is 3.5 hours, so I will not be offended if you feel like you've gotten enough from it and you want to jump off. I'll make sure that I get training certificates to Sandy for all of you. So, and somebody still has their mic open. Carol, do you have your mic open?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you close it down? Thank you. All right, let me shut the door so that I don't drive everybody here crazy. Faith, are you up? Oh, okay. All right. All right, I have one person here in the training room that I didn't know was coming, so she's out there trying to get herself booted up. So, okay, these are our objectives for today. We are going to talk about the effects of early trauma on children's brains. When children are removed from their homes or subjected to what we see all these kids being subjected to all the time, neglect and abuse and the whole gamut of the opioid addiction that we're all going through. Hold on, let me let Faith in. We have had to develop different ways of working with our little ones. Certainly if you're working with older kids, you can sit down and have a conversation with them, but then even not always. So we really try to teach our therapists how to use play therapy in trauma work. Now, today is March 16th, and it was 3 years ago, on March 18th of 2020, that we all shut down, that the whole world shut down, but Circle of Friends shut down. And we had to learn within a week. It was quite a scramble for those of you who remember it. We had to learn how to do telemedicine. We had not done it before. We didn't have the forms for it. We didn't have the policies. We didn't have the protocols, but we did it in a week. And we got up and running. And we had to then learn a whole different way of working with kids on camera. And I will say that in the 3 years, I think our therapists have done a master class in learning how to do some of this stuff on Zoom. However, we are coming out of it now, and there is no question that working with very young children on telehealth is very, very difficult. So we're getting our little ones back again, and we're getting a lot more therapists coming in talking about learning how to do play therapy. So this training is somewhat timely for that. And I, for one, am really glad that we're back because I have missed the work that we did with our 2 to 5s. So let's talk about what we know about helping maltreated kids. Maltreated kids always have certain things in common. No matter what the form of maltreatment, they all have certain things in common. And they almost all have early onset trauma. And when I say that, I mean that like 0 to 5-year-old, if you, and I know that the GALs are privy to all of this information, if you look at the comprehensive behavioral health assessments of any of these kids, or the functional family assessments, or the shelter petitions, almost all of these kids have had something happen to them in the first 5 years of life. And we're going to talk a little bit more about why that is so impactful. If almost everything that you learn in the first 3 years of life, if those early years are impacted by trauma, your ability to learn, to trust, to attach are extremely badly affected. So we're looking at early onset trauma. We're looking at separation from caregivers. Even pathogenic caregivers, children that are removed from their caregivers, are impacted by that separation. One of the things that we have seen is that when kids are being raised, if you will, by opioid parents, what we've seen with the opioid addictions difficulties is that these parents don't give these kids anything at all. Parents that are addicted to opioids usually are just completely unaware of where their children are. And those are the kids that the child protective investigators find in closets, or locked in rooms, or uncared for, unfed, unchanged, wandering around neighborhoods unattended. These are just children that have had very, very little. And that's a difference. The opioid dilemma has really created a different kind of trauma for these kids. Because earlier, before the opioid problem, kids would come in and maybe they had been beaten, maybe they had been sexually abused, maybe something horrible had happened for them, but they knew they had parents. A lot of these little ones coming in have been taught nothing. They've not been taught any kind of daily living skills. They haven't been taught that they have a right to be cared for, which makes them a whole different paradigm when they come into foster care, because they don't expect anybody else to take care of them either. Most of these kids have had multiple placements. We do a lot of work to try to prevent placement disruption. But despite that, a lot of these kids have had multiple placements by the time we get them. So they've had their attachment and their bonding interrupted. They've been separated from whoever was supposed to care for them. They've been bounced around. And I always leave this up here. Chaotic child welfare systems, we just can't help it, folks. I've been doing child welfare for 40 years, and I've been doing it in several states. It is an imperfect system. It's an imperfect system meant to deal with a very imperfect problem. So no matter how hard we try, chaotic child welfare systems add to this. And how do they add to this? How many times have you tried to contact your case manager and they're gone? The shelf life of a case manager is very, very short. It's a horrible job. It's probably the worst job in child welfare. I had it for a while, so I know. It is a job that nobody is meant to have, and people don't stay in those jobs for very long. So kids come into the child welfare system. They are subjected to multiple removals, which means multiple caretakers that they don't know. They end up in different daycare centers. They end up in different schools, different case managers, different therapists, and that just adds to the chaos of their lives. So this is what we look for when we're looking at maltreated kids. And what do we know about the effects of trauma on children? Donald Hebbs has a saying, cells that fire together wire together. What he means by that is that, and it's those of you who are parents, when you have your baby and you bring your baby home from the hospital, you learn what your baby wants. Your baby cries, you figure out why they're crying. You figure out if they need to be changed, do they need to be fed, do they just need to be cuddled? What is it that they need? And as you try to figure out what they need, your cellular connection to your baby is going to wire together. It's just an organic thing that God put on this earth to happen, and it does happen. But what if you don't have any of that? What if you did not have any caretaker that would take care of you? This is why we absolutely know, and actually Derek was in my office last night talking about this, that when you look at the brain scan of an under 5 that has had very little connection to another human being, that child's brain does not develop in the same way. That child's brain has deficits that a normally attached, connected child is going to have a lot of their brain filled in. Neglected children don't have that. So separation absolutely affects brain development. Early trauma affects brain development. And in infant mental health, there's a saying, there's no such thing as a baby. There's a baby and someone, because babies cannot survive on their own, can they? A baby left without anyone to take care of him is going to die. One of our other trainings that I know, I always laugh when I tell this story, because Carol at one point asked me if I would just find a new video. We have a video, well, actually it's an old 35mm research thing of babies in orphanages in the early stages of the recovery from World War II. And those babies were not cared for. Those babies had maybe one caretaker to 50 babies. So they weren't being cared for, they weren't being held, they weren't being nurtured, and they did not grow. And if you really look at the video, and it will say, this is a 7-month-old baby, this is a 10-month-old baby. And in most cases, they look like they're about 3, maybe 4 months old. And the research on those orphanages is that a lot of those babies died. And they didn't die because they were sick. They died because there was nobody to take care of them. And when you look at the records on that, it will say this baby died from a cold, this baby died from the flu. And they had to put something in the death records. But in fact, a lot of babies that were raised in orphanages just didn't survive. So when we say there's no such thing as a baby, there's a baby and someone. Your children had a someone. A lot of the kids that we see in foster care just didn't have that someone, and they didn't have someone to teach them that they were worthy of love. So on a very, very basic level, if you don't look at anything else that has happened to these kids that come into foster care, you need to look at this, because it absolutely does affect their ability to develop cognitively, to develop neurologically, and to learn that they can connect with somebody.
Barbara, we also want to look at, what was happening with the mom during the pregnancy or throughout the pregnancy, if we can, because sometimes research shows that children are affected by trauma when they're in the womb. So it does change those brain connections.
Yeah, Eileen, that is a good point. And it absolutely is. And a lot of that research is ongoing. I mean, certainly with the kids that we are looking at in foster care, it's very hard to find any of them that came into this world without some kind of in utero drug involvement, whether it's just pot or whether it's something much worse. And if they didn't get exposed to it in utero, they get exposed to it afterwards. But we're really kind of looking at what happens to a mother who's going through incredible stress, domestic violence, alcoholism, drug addiction, horrible maltreatment. What happens to that mother, and what does she impart to the baby? So thank you for that, Eileen. All right, this is just a little brief video. These are our our world-class neurological champions that are in this video.
Early childhood trauma changes the biology of the brain. Or early childhood support also changes the biology of the brain.
What studies of resilience show that even when children have insecure attachments in the home, if they've had at least one secure attachment with a daycare provider, a preschool teacher, or another adult in their lives, then that makes a huge difference for them having the seed of resilience. They may still have difficulties, but because they've had that one secure relationship, that relationship where they felt that another individual, another adult knows them, feels what's going on inside of them, those kids have the potential to do very well in the future.
We can see imaging today of before and after trauma and see what happens in the brain. And we can also see repair that happens in the brain when our interventions have been successful.
What makes children get better following a trauma is connection to other human beings who are present, who are patient, who are kind, who are sensitive. And they don't need to be necessarily psychologically insightful. They don't need to know anything about trauma. All they need to know is that they're right there with this child. They're trying to be comforting. They're trying to be supportive. They're trying to encourage. Those kinds of interactions end up being much more therapeutic and healing than many of the other things that we try to do with kids.
Teachers can look more at their children, be more emotionally present for children, touch them, work on their own nervous system and their own regulation. If they're angry and they're out of control in terms of what's going on inside of themselves, the message that they're going to convey to the child is, I'm angry and I don't like you.
If you're an adult and there are children in your life, whether you're in law enforcement, a teacher, a parent, a foster parent, whatever you are, and you know that a child has been exposed to something that's potentially traumatic, the first thing that you should be aware of is that not all traumatic events lead to disastrous mental health outcomes. In fact, the vast majority of children that are traumatized actually do pretty well, but they do need your attention, they do need your kind support, and they do need your awareness about what are warning signs that would tell you to actually take the next step and try to get some professional help.
It's up to us. We can't wait for a day to do this spreading of the message that we can do something about it, that children, especially young children, have the most possibility for health and plasticity, for overcoming these early traumas, if we as a community, a large community, support them.
We have permission now to meet children's needs. We have permission now from neuroscience to give children what they need. And to me, that is so exciting.
If there was one place I would like to start with individuals as well as our society trying to make a difference to really stop the cross-generational passage of trauma and of insecure attachment, it would be for parents to start the process of self-understanding. It basically costs nothing except the time and emotion that it takes for parents to begin on that process. And we all can do it. And the people who benefit most, besides ourselves, are our children.
We're spending literally 95% of our public dollars to change the brain, because that's what mental health is. That's what public education is. That's what juvenile justice intervention is. All of these are trying to change the brain. And we're spending almost nothing in the first 5 years of life when the brain is easiest to modify. And it takes the least amount of professional input, the least amount of insight. It takes just high quality caregiving.
It's us, not they. It's each one of us doing it now, not later, but now.
Those are all the rock stars of neuroscience, Bruce Perry and Dan Siegel and Jeannie Siegel and all of them. They're all really, all of those people, that little video is probably, I don't know, 10 years old, but those are all the people that really pioneered the whole study of what happens to children when they are traumatized and what happens to their brains. However, there's one other thing I want you to hear from that. When Bruce Perry says you don't have to be psychologically insightful, you have to be kind and consistent. When you go into a foster home and you're doing play therapy and the foster mother says to you, all you did was play with him, because believe me, that is a comment that we get quite a lot. One of the values of starting your therapy with the expressive therapies, with the play therapies, is that at the very least, even if you are not tremendously skilled at sand tray or art or storytelling, you are sitting one-on-one with a child, making eye contact, giving connection. And that is one of the most compelling reasons for us to get back to in-person work. There is a place for telemedicine, and I know some of you do it and do it very well, but it is very hard to do it with our little ones. And the value, if you just could strip it down to the lowest common denominator, the value of play therapy is sitting, being one-on-one with a child and doing some kind of a nurturing, pleasant, fun activity. Because then, as we see, as we're going to begin to talk about the play therapy techniques, you're allowing a child to achieve a sense of safety before they process some of the stuff that you're going to get into with them. So what happens to the traumatized baby brain? Well, quite simply, the traumatized baby brain gets stuck. We talk about this, actually, this is a Bruce Perry graphic. We talk about the brain developing differently in a state of chronic trauma, and the brain develops from the bottom up. Your brainstem controls the base of your brain. It just controls breathing and pooping and going to the bathroom, things like that, things that you're not thinking about. That's the brainstem, and that develops first. But your midbrain and your limbic system is where everything gets stuck for our kids. The reason we don't try to talk to them in the beginning is this, when we do the brain training and we talk about the prefrontal cortex, which is where rational thought is and where language is and where reasoning is and where cognition is. This part is very poorly developed with little kids. So other ways to meet their needs are really kind of getting at the part of their brain where they feel stuck and unsafe. And once you unlock that, and once you allow them to feel safe, then you can move into more of the talk therapies. And I'm talking about little kids. To be honest with you, it's true for any human being. If you have, I think I just did a crisis de-escalation training for a group home a couple weeks ago. And we talked about, they have older kids, and they have older kids that are very, very badly traumatized. And when we talk to the childcare workers about saying, if you have a kid that's blowing up and breaking windows and smashing the furniture, that child's brain is not thinking, I think I'm going to break this window. That child's brain has been triggered, and he is now, or she is stuck in that limbic system of not feeling safe. So saying to a child, calm down, is not going to help anything. So you can really apply these principles to any age. So if we're going to talk about what happens to all of the kids that we work with, let's talk about what happens in the first 3 years of life. Because if your brain is affected by chronic trauma and it is not developing normally, these are the things that you have to do as a baby. You have a lot of work to do when you come into the world. You got a lot of very heavy tasks, and you have some very specific jobs when you are a baby. And we're talking about the first 3 years of life. Think about your own children. Think about the children that you have worked with who've come into foster care. The first 3 years of life, we have to learn how to regulate our emotions. Why is that important? Think about all the kids that we have in foster care that are on what medication for what disorder. Almost every kid that we have in foster care is on some kind of medication for ADHD. Does that mean that they all have ADHD? It doesn't, but it does mean that they, as babies, were never led to learn how to regulate their emotions. So these are the kids, if you look at the video of the orphanage that I was talking about, you see these babies just rocking back and forth because they have no way to regulate whatever's going on inside them. You see older kids, these are your headbangers, these are your rockers. These are the kids that are sitting, rocking in a chair or repetitive motion. These are the kids as they get older that begin to abuse substances because they have never been taught in babyhood how to regulate and express emotions. And how do we do that? We do that with our caretaker, don't we? We do that with our loved caretaker. So we have to learn how to regulate our emotions. We have to learn how to form attaching relationships. If we don't have somebody in our life, and I think Dan Siegel said it in that video, if you have one person in your childhood that is kind to you, that is connected to you, that will teach you that you're worthy of love, that is better than not having any. And I think we see that with our kids. I don't think that Robert is on this training. Robert was in here yesterday, Robert Vento, and he was talking about a kid that he worked with years ago that still calls him and will still say, well, you know, I know that I haven't actually seen you in 5 years, but when I did see you, you were kind to me. You made an impact on me. And this kid will call him to say, okay, Robert, I got in trouble, or I didn't get in trouble. I did really well in school. And this was all from a very short, but a very impactful connection. So we have to learn how to regulate our emotions. We have to learn that there's somebody out there that cares about us. And we have to explore the environment and learn from it. And what does that mean? If any of you are familiar with the circle of security, for example, circle of security is one of those evidence-based practices that case management organizations absolutely love. And I have a really cute little video that talks about the circle of security. It costs about $1,000 to go to a weekend training. And then you have to go to, as with all of the evidence-based practices, you have to go through a period where you're supervised by someone else who has become a master trainer in evidence in circle of security. What is it? It is teaching a child that I will be here as your caretaker when you need me, but when you need to go out into the world and explore, it's okay. And then I will be here when you need to come back. So I just saved you all $1,000. I'm not saying it's not a good model. I'm just saying that's it. So how do these stages not develop for our children? Emotional development, we rely on the adults in our life, don't we, to regulate our emotions? And if you think about your own babies, when you brought your babies home from the hospital, depending on how old you are and at what stage of parent education you were in at the time, most of us, when we first bring our babies home, if they cry, we go to them, don't we? When we don't even know these kids at that point. I was watching young Sheldon the other day, and the 17-year-old Georgie just had a baby, and he can't get the baby to stop crying. And he says to the mother of the baby, well, I just met her yesterday. So he was kind of talking about, I don't know how to stop her from crying, because he really saw this baby as an individual. And he said, I just met her yesterday. I don't know how to get her to stop crying. But we learn through our caretakers how to regulate emotions. And for those of you who've sat through this before, and some of you have, the concept of the good enough mother is good enough to know when to pull back and say, okay, kid, I've been rocking you for 6 months now, and now you're 8 months old, and I'm going to put you in your crib and I'm going to let you fuss a little, because if you fuss a little, you'll learn how to put yourself to sleep. The good enough mother or the good enough father, we don't want to be discriminatory, but the good enough parent is going to know when to say, I have given you nurturance, I've given you attachment, I have proven to you that I love you. Now I'm going to let you learn how to regulate some of your own stuff. I'm going to let you play by yourself in your crib for a little bit because I can't be there all the time. And that's okay, because that teaches kids to regulate. But think about our kids. When our kids, and we were talking about the opioid parents, infants of severely depressed or severely missing caretakers, just they miss the whole transition to self-regulation because nobody's there to care for them. There's nobody there to normalize. This is when I'm going to take care of you, and this is when I'm going to let you kind of go do it on your own. So that's in a nutshell why kids in foster care don't reach the stage of self-regulation that children raised by nurturing, attaching parents do, because there's just nobody there for them. And I don't think you can underestimate that either, because the whole concept that you are good enough and worthy of love is what attachment and bonding is all about. And if you don't have any of that, I mean, we look at some of these kids that are coming into group care now, and I know the GALs are quite aware of this. Maybe my therapists are not as much, but with the new laws that have come into play about keeping kids in less restrictive settings, called the FFPSA law, kids are not being put into group homes as readily. In order to go into group homes, they have to qualify. And in order to qualify, they usually have to have pretty serious mental health diagnoses. These are the kids that the child care staff at places like Florida United are struggling to deal with right now, because these are the kids that have missed all of these stages of self-regulation. These are the kids that had early onset trauma, multiple placements, multiple mental health diagnoses, but they have not been neurologically formed, and this is why. So we have the first task is self-regulation, but the second, and by no means second, is developing relationships with caretakers. If you have stable people in your life, or even and it can be a stable foster parent, it can be a stable relative caregiver. Where would we be without grandparents who are raising so many of our children right now? These relationships are essential for these kids. We have a lot of kids who have been removed from parents who are now placed, a huge number of kids who are placed with relative caregivers. And those caregivers can be that stable attachment for those kids. But a lot of the children that we are seeing coming into care have just not had any of this. They haven't had stable, consistent relationships. So when we had to give up working with our 2 to 5s during the pandemic, the central focus of our work with those kids, it was not so much to crawl into the crib with the 2-year-old, but to help the 2-year-old and that caretaker learn how to connect and attach with each other. That's what infant mental health is. It is helping caretakers learn what these kids need and helping these kids learn what caregivers can give them. So improving that is the central focus of working with this population. And if you look into a child's history, you look into the CBHA, you look into any of the records that you have on some of these children and say, why are we not being successful with these children? And Eileen, I'm thinking about you with the conversation we had the other day about the girl that you're working with. This is a girl who is, if I'm remembering, is 11, is a failed adoption,
Yes.
who has been through multiple placements, and who is just saying to Eileen, I don't care. I don't care what you tell me. I don't care what you're doing. And we kind of talked about that, didn't we, Eileen? I mean,
Yes.
how can you really intervene with a kid who has had no stable relationships with anybody? It's really, really hard. And I give Eileen credit for even hanging in there for as long as she has. So
Yeah, she's a tough cookie, so we'll see.
but you know what? Eileen is sticking in there with her. And I said to her, so where's the foster parent? Is the foster parent getting ready to give up? And she said, well, not the foster mom, but maybe the foster dad. And that's what happens. is that because these kids have had no relationships with caregivers, they don't know how to form relationships with a foster parent who's saying, come on, let me take care of you. Let me read you a story. Let me make you dinner. Let me help you get dressed in the morning. They don't know how to do any of that. And because they reject, like Eileen's little girl is rejecting, they reject the foster parents, and the foster parents get weary and say, okay, maybe I'm just going to put in my 30-day. That's the foster care dilemma. What else do we have to do as babies and young children? We have to learn how to interact with people. We have to learn how to read the cues of the person in front of us, which is an incredibly difficult thing. And I was just writing a proposal for one of the CVCs who wants us to provide mother-baby interaction, and we're kind of developing that program. But one of the things I was talking about with the CEO the other day is that because these kids have been removed at a young age from their caregivers have now, think about what happens when very young kids are removed. They often don't see their caregivers right after they're removed. And they lose the ability to really remember who their caregivers are. And their caregivers forget how to read their cues because they haven't been around them. And think about your own babies. When you brought your baby home from the hospital, when I'm thinking of Elizabeth, when she brought Jillian home from the hospital, she had a picture that she posted, that she shared with all of us, that she was in the car with her husband's on one side, Elizabeth's on the other side, and Daisy, our office manager, said, where's the baby? And I said, I think she's kind of in there, but she was so little at that point, because she was like a month early, wasn't she?
She was 6.5 weeks early, yeah. But in that same picture, after we took it, we're like, okay, now what? We're bringing her home from the NICU, like, now what do we do? Like, we just have her?
Yeah, that is so true. And
yeah, she was like 4 pounds. She was tiny.
Yeah, she was tiny, and she'll probably join us at some point this morning when she wakes up, because she usually does, and you'll see that she's bigger now. But
She's over here eating breakfast for like 2 hours now.
I guess the point I'm trying to make is that if you as a caretaker and you as a child don't see each other, I took a picture of my son, probably 1,000 pictures of him every single day. And then I would look at him like a month later and go, well, this kid doesn't look anything like this month-old kid. And this 2-month-old kid doesn't look anything like the month-old kid. And you have to really remember that these young caretakers don't know. They haven't seen their babies. So now the transporter brings the baby in, and the caretaker looks at the baby and says, who's that? So they lose that ability to interact with each other, which is really why it has been so important for us as therapists to advocate for frequent visitation for people who have lost their children at very young ages. The ability to have a consistent child caregiver relationship is what builds attachment and bonding. And our kids just don't have that ability to interact because they haven't had anybody consistently in their life. I'm going to show you that. I think I have the still face in this, because most of you who've been with me for a while have seen the still face about 1,000 times. But the still face is a really, really good example of, well, I'll show it to you when I get to it. The really good example of a stable, attached child who loses the ability to interface with his attachment figure is really going to react very badly. But kids who have not had an ability to interact, if you Google the still face on YouTube, there's a lot of them, but there are some of children who have been cared for by very depressed parents, and they don't react to the still face because they're not used to having that interaction. So what are the challenges of working with kids that are maltreated when they're very, very young? Almost all of our children were maltreated or had some kind of maltreatment in the very early days of their life. Sometimes we don't get that in the CBHA. Sometimes we don't get it when we get the referral. Sometimes all the referral says is this child needs counseling. This child is 8. This child is in foster care. This child was removed 2 years ago. This child needs counseling. So your job as therapists sometimes to really be like on a treasure hunt and try to figure out what happened. And that's why we try to get the information from you for you. But you've all had times when you've been working with kids that you don't know anything about. I mean, you know that they're acting like maltreated children. You know that they don't have what we would consider a normal ability to attach or to connect or to expect anything from you, but you don't know what happened. So we have to really try to connect the dots with these kids, and because they're not going to remember what happened. So how are we going to connect the dots? This is what, when I look at a CBHA, these are the things that I'm looking for. If I can find these things in a CBHA, if I can find these things in anything in this child's record, then I'm going to say, okay, this is a child we have to work with for early trauma. We have to work with on lack of attachment and bonding, and probably some neurological deficits that we can remediate, but we have to be aware that they're there. So what are we looking for? We're looking for very young parents. A lot of these parents are quite young. And a lot of these parents have come from intergenerational abuse and neglect. When you really get into the history of a lot of these families, some of these things go back for generations. And if you've been given nothing, you can't give away what you don't possess. So if you've already been raised by parents that didn't care for you, you don't know that you're supposed to then give this to your child. So we look at lack of prenatal care. Why do so many of these young mothers not get prenatal care? There's really 2 big reasons. And one of them is that half the time they don't even know they're pregnant. So the whole, wherever you sit in the abortion issue, the problem with limiting abortion at such an early stage of the pregnancy is that a lot of these young parents don't even know that they're pregnant. Now, you are probably fairly regulated people, or you wouldn't be where you are. For women who were trying to get pregnant, there were tools that we used. There was the temperatures, there were the basal charts, there was checking your period, making sure that you knew when you had your fertile cycle. This isn't the way some of these young people lived. Half of the time, they don't even know what month it is, what day it is. It's just that their lives have not been kind to them. So they don't know that they're pregnant. And they're usually, very often, if they're abusing substances, what happened when you went for your monthly checkup? You always had to give a urine sample, didn't you? And the urine sample would then show that you were abusing substance. So if you're going to abuse, and many, many people do, then you're not going to get prenatal care. One of the things that I was told by the CEO of CPC, Community-Based Care of Volusia Flagler, is that a very, very large portion of their removals in the last year have been at birth, and have been due to neonatal, what is it called? Neonatal being born addicted. Can't think of what the whole title is. But an increasing number of children are being removed at birth because their parents were abusing, and because they are now born drug addicted. So that's all part of that cycle. And now we have a separation from the infant in the very first year of their life, in the very early days of their life. One of the saddest things you can do as a child protective investigator is have to go to the hospital and remove a baby at birth. Because even if the parents are not terribly aware of what's going on, at some point they're going to be, and the baby is going to be. And it's a really difficult start for both baby and mother and parent. A lot of these kids have multiple caregivers. A lot of these kids have developmental delays. Now, think about what we were talking about before about neurological development. Why do these kids have developmental delays? What causes kids who have had all of this terrible start in the first couple of years of their life to maybe not be right on top of things the way their normally attached and cared for counterparts would be. Come on,
So many things.
say it. What again, Eileen?
So many things.
Such as?
I mean, if the mom used substances during
Right.
pregnancy, if there was any type of domestic violence, if
Right.
there's baby sense a lot of things, the attachment's poor or indifferent.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. You cannot underestimate how important you are to your children until you see children who have not been cared for. Because just the normal things that we teach our children how to do. Somebody was in, I don't remember who it was, somebody was in here the other day telling me about working with a foster child who's a little bit older, maybe like 11, 12, who came in and didn't know how to tie their shoes and didn't know how to take care of their hair, didn't know when they were supposed to brush their teeth, just didn't know how to do daily living skills because nobody ever taught them how to do
That's
it.
my 11-year-old, Barbara, that we were talking about.
You're right. Thank you, Eileen. I knew it was somebody. And here's a kid who's just not had consistent caretaking. So she can look delayed. She probably has the appearance of delays, but she's just not been taught. Nobody knows how to do these things if a caretaker doesn't teach them how to do these things. I always remember working at Florida United Methodist when I first moved here, and the nurse said to me, these girls don't know anything about taking care of their periods. They don't know how to toilet, because if you think about it, you have to be toilet trained. And with a lot of these kids that were constantly having accidents or didn't know how to take care of their menstrual cycle, it was just because they had never been taught. And they had the appearance of being very delayed, and they weren't necessarily cognitively delayed. They just had not been taught how to do things. The other thing that we see with speech delays is not so much that they can't speak, but how do you learn how to speak? How do you learn language?
Being spoken to.
Yeah, somebody's got to talk to you. And if nobody talks to you, and that is very common too, and sadly it's becoming a lot more common, with people sitting and texting instead of talking to their children, but a lot of children have just not been talked to. And if you're not spoken to, you don't learn language. And if you're depressed, if you're using substances, if you are very, very depressed and you have mental health issues and you're not talking to your children, and you don't realize, when Eileen referenced having in utero effects, what did we get kind of crazy about a couple of years ago? Putting, what did we do? Baby Mozart, putting Mozart on the radio, or putting Mozart on your DVD player on your baby bump, so that your baby could learn to be calm and soothe through Mozart. Whether that worked or not, I have no idea. But we did learn that we try to nurture our children in every way we can. We look at a lot of these kids and they are not nurtured in this way. I did supervised visitation when one of the first cases that we had at Circle of Friends, they asked me if I would do supervised visitation, and it was 4 little boys and the mother. And I said yes. And I've always remembered it because this mother came in, she hadn't seen them for 9 months. And she came in and she had a little notebook, and she asked them all what shoe size they were. These are little kids, they didn't know what shoe size they were, but she asked them what size shoe they wore. She had Happy Meals for all of them. She handed them all the Happy Meals, and that was the end of the interaction. For the next 2 hours, she just sat there and watched them, and they were used to not talking to her. So they just kind of went off and took care of themselves and played. And normally with supervised visitation, we will with little kids, we'll show them the hands on the clock and say, okay, when this hand gets here, mommy's got to leave. Mommy's going to have to leave in 15 minutes. When this hand goes here, we did all these things with these kids. They paid absolutely no attention to me. They were so busy playing with each other. She got up, she left. They didn't even know she was gone.
Barbara, can I add something? I know the picture here is about early child, but I've run into prior with foster parents where they'll have the kids take their showers and then put their school clothes on. So they sleep in their school clothes. They have everything on except their shoes, so it doesn't take so long in the morning. You know, so these are the kinds of things too. That's just an added confusion on, you know, daily life living skills and how to care for oneself.
Yeah. We have had some unusual experiences with foster parents. I don't know about who Carol's talking about, with some of my early days of foster care, and I will readily admit it's gotten a whole lot better over the years. But the early days of my working in foster care, the expectation was just to provide physical care. There wasn't any expectation that you were going to nurture or care for. It was just make sure they're fed, make sure they're clothed, make sure that you somehow get them to school, and God forbid they have lice and they have to come home. But I think we have gotten better. But again, these are always, you're looking at kids that are raised by someone other than the person who's supposed to love them. So these are, and I'm not, to Carol's point, any age child can carry these scars. If you're working with a 15-year-old, a 16-year-old that's had all this happen, you're still dealing with those scars. The only thing I would like to say about this particular slide is that, and I have said it the last couple of times I've done this training, that I think we have vastly underestimated the effect of parental separation when we send parents to deployment for months at a time. The picture of this father either coming or going with these little kids. If you look on YouTube has this whole series of joyful reunions when people come back from deployment, whether they're in Afghanistan or Iraq or Vietnam or Korea, wherever they were. And you watch these carefully staged things where the guy's there with the camera and the father's hiding behind the door, and the third grader is about to go out to the playground. Now she sees her father, or he sees her father. Watch those things. They're supposed to be joyful. They're so traumatic for these little kids. When they rejoin their parents, they are so traumatized, and their parents are so traumatized. We may say these are tears of joy, but these are videos of tremendous pain when these kids finally reconnect. And they don't even talk about the parent that slept at home, who is trying to take care of the children who are now separated from the parents. So these are all events that kids suffer from. So that kind of goes right into what Carol was saying about having older kids. How are older kids, any age kid, going to be affected by early abuse? Kids that are abused in the early stages, if your abuse happens to you, or your neglect, or what your maltreatment happens to you when you're quite young, you may not have the verbal connection to say, this is what happened to me. If you just think for a minute about what your very first cognitive memory is, think about how old you were if you go back and say, oh, I do remember that. It usually is a memory. It's one of two things. It's either a memory that you have because by now you have language. So you have enough language to attach to that memory to say, well, yeah, I was 4 when I saw my father coming in and this is what happened. But the other thing is, a lot of us have our earlier memories from our siblings, because our older siblings are great for saying, when you were 2, you did this. And you don't really remember that. It becomes your memory because your older brother or older sister are saying, this is the family script. When you were 2, this is what you did, and you look silly. But for most kids, the early abuse is stored in implicit memory. And the reason, one of the salient reasons that we do expressive therapy and play therapy is that we're trying to help kids access those memories, and those memories are kind of stuck. When I talk about the hot sauce baby, we did have a very young child. It was in Kissimmee, and he was 2 months old, and he was removed from a dad along with the 4-year-old brother. And the 4-year-old brother was able to tell the CPI that the dad was very mean to the baby. The baby was taken to the hospital. The baby had several fractures and was placed with a grandma. And the grandma was very, very nurturing with the baby. And the baby eventually began to nurture back. So now the baby's been in the home maybe 4 or 5 months old, 4 or 5 months. And hold on a second, let me get rid of that. I don't always know how to use my new phone here. Obviously, I still don't know how to use it because I'm not turning it off. Sorry. The baby came home from the hospital. Grandma took the baby in. Grandma was very nurturing, and the baby began to cuddle into her. Took a while, and then one day the therapist came out to see the 4-year-old, and the grandma had been eating tacos, and she leaned over the baby, and the baby recoiled and began screaming. And at that point, the 4-year-old said, well, Daddy used to take a diaper and dip it in hot sauce and stick it in the baby's mouth. So the baby was having an implicit memory. The baby was being triggered because of the smell of the hot sauce. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about implicit memories. There's no way that baby is well, now that baby is probably 10 years old, but there's no way that that child is ever going to remember cognitively what happened to him when he was 2 months old. He may always be triggered by the smell of hot sauce, and he may have to learn how to deal with that and say, well, that was from something that happened, and I have to learn how to deal with it. But implicit memories are the reason that we do play therapy. And I'm going to show you this, the still face in a minute. When you bring your baby home from the hospital, you learn, as I said before, how to interact on a cellular level. You learn what that baby knows. You learn what the baby wants. And the baby learns that if he or she cries, you're going to come. You're going to take care of him. You're going to nurture him. You're going to feed him. You're going to change him. You're going to make him happy. You're going to make him comfortable. Babies learn that that's what's going to happen. And that begins to shape their brain growth. Now, what happens if you take that caretaker away from that baby? It's going to affect the neurological behavior of the baby, and it's going to affect their emotional regulation. And it absolutely does. And we can't underestimate that. If we have removed a baby from a caretaker, if the caretaker gave that baby anything, the baby is going to react. Now, what do? We, of course, try to find a nurturing foster home. We try to make sure that there's enough interaction between the separated caretaker and the baby, but it does affect the baby. It affects the baby's emotional regulation. Now, why do I say this? I have been, the first case management job I had was in 1974. I was I just got my bachelor's degree. And we would remove sibling groups, and they were Friday afternoon was the champion time to remove a sibling group. So, and who's gonna, you're trying to get home yourself, and now you got 4 kids that you got to place, and but one of them's a baby. So the first thing that we did and have always done is to say, well, okay, the baby won't know where the baby is, so we'll find a place for the baby, because it was always easier to place a baby than it was to place older children. So the go-to, our go-to answer to all this was to take the baby and stick the baby someplace, because we said, well, the baby won't know. The baby won't know that they're missing. Well, they did know, and they knew that they were not around the people who cared for them. And very often it wasn't their parents. Very often it was their siblings. So if you think about any sibling group that you have worked with, there's almost always a parentified sibling. There's almost always that sibling that cares for the other siblings. And those were the relationships that babies missed. When I worked at Neighbor to Family, there was a very large sibling group that came in, and they used to try to place the sibling groups together. And same thing, the baby was separated. The other siblings were eventually, I think they were split up into 3 different homes. But the very first time we brought all this group back in for a sibling visit, not only did the parentified sibling rush to pick up the baby immediately began to cry and reach out for the parentified sibling. So if you think that, did we make mistakes? We always make mistakes in child welfare. Those were just my early mistakes, because then we thought that babies didn't care. And now we know that they do. So healthy attachment, when I say timing is everything, this is why the first couple of years of their life is so important. And if you have kids that you're working with that are 14 or 15, and you're going back and saying, well, you know, the first couple of years of their life, they had a pretty rough time, and they're still having a pretty rough time, this is why. We now know that the human brain develops 75 to 85% of everything it's going to learn in the first 3 years of life. This is when all of the brain systems responsible for future functioning and development and regulation and attachment, all of this stuff is built in your brain in the first 3 years of life. And we have a lot of videos that we've collected that show this graphically. But when you are born, your brain is born with millions and millions of dendrites and connections. And as you begin to do different tasks, the brain starts to prune off the things that it doesn't need. And it's left with the connections of the things that you do need. And those are the things that you're going to need to develop as you grow older. So the majority of your brain systems are developed during this period. And if you are neglected during this period, if there's nobody in your life to try to train you or to try to show you how to attach, how to do different things, then your brain is not going to develop normally. And the CAT scans that Derek was talking about yesterday are very, very telling. That I think they showed it very briefly on that little video, that a CAT scan of a child who's been abused is going to show big holes in the development of their brain. A normally attached and developed child, where their brains will have filled in those holes. Now, does that mean that you can never remediate? No, it doesn't. You can. Brains are very plastic when kids are little, and that's where your work comes in. But you just have to know that their brains are affected by this. And you've got to have some kind of bonding. You have to have some kind of bonding during the first year of life if you're going to develop normally. And when I say you must, there are very, very few children who don't have at least one something in their life in the first year. And sometimes we say that kind of like, well, you know, they're never going to get better. Of course they are. Most kids have at least one someone in the first year of life. And I found this in the New Yorker a long time ago that just said that the wolves are saying that kid we raised is tracking us. Most children have something, even if it's pathogenic care, there's somebody out there. And that's what we have to build and build upon when we're working with them. Now, this is where reactive attachment disorder got a pretty crappy name. Back in the 90s, that we were taught that, and I was in that group, that children who were neglected in the first couple of years of life could never learn how to be normal human beings. That is absolutely not true. But in the first year of life, you've got that brain. It's wired, it's ready to go. The brain systems are ready to be developed. If we don't need all these other billions of things that are extraneous to our success as human beings, we're going to prune those off and we're going to be left with the good stuff. The brain systems of attachment. When we say they're the groundwork for the development of conscience, of empathy, of any kind of character trait like kindness or sympathy or whatever, these systems are all laid in the first couple of years of life. The fact that they are impaired, the fact that they may not be developed as much as a normally attached child, doesn't mean that they can't be. That's where your work comes in. That's where a nurturing caretaker comes in, that you can learn, you teach children how to develop conscience. Kids don't raise themselves. Kids do not come out of the womb and kind of raise themselves. There's always somebody there. And if there isn't, that's where you come in. That's where foster parents come in. That's where some of the helping professionals in the child welfare come in. But this can be remediated. And this is my famous still face experiment. This is on YouTube.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 34 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. And the still face experiment what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby who's about a year of age. And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her. This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions. They turn away. They feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Yeah. I'm here. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
I really like that video, which is probably why I make you guys watch it all the time. But what you have to understand and take away from the still face experiment, and don't try this at home, by the way, because I have had people come in and say, well, I tried to do that with my daughter and she didn't act like that. So I guess I'm not very attached to my daughter, and that's not the purpose of this. But that is a very regulated experiment. And when the mother is asked to hold the still face, she's asked to hold the still face for 2 minutes and then come back. And I would expect that little Becky is probably 8 or 10 years old now, because this has been around for a while. But you saw that child very quickly respond to the fact that that normally attentive, loving, nurturing mother was not there. And you saw her in 2 minutes begin to cry. She used what babies do. Babies screech, because we always love that in restaurants when they're all screeching. And babies point, because most babies are used to their caretakers watching where they point. That's just something that we just all do as caretakers. And she tried to point, she tried to screech, and then she just began to cry. because she was terribly upset that this mother was not there. But then what happened when the mother turned around? What did you see happen almost immediately when that mom turned around? What'd she do?
She was happy again. Her mom was back.
Yeah, quickly.
Yes.
She was happy again because her mother was back. And the thing with still face, and if you Google it on YouTube, there's a lot of them. She learned, you could see that she had been taught by a very nurturing mother. And the minute the mother withdrew that, the baby reacted to it. So what I always say is, if you don't think you're important to your children, think again. Watch this. This took 2 minutes for this kid to lose her mind. And it took about 10 seconds for her to come right back once that mother came back to where she was used to her being. So attachment and nurturing is incredibly important to children. And children who don't have it, there's one up there of a very depressed mother. She had severe postpartum depression. And it's kind of sad because she didn't know how to play with the baby. She was too depressed to play with the baby, and the baby paid no attention to her. So when she turned around and turned back again, she had the same face because she was suffering from severe postpartum, and the baby didn't react. The baby didn't even notice she was back. So it's a really good experiment to show you that attachment is really important, and you are very important to your children if you don't think you are. So when I say if there's no bonding, this is not going to happen. I mean, there's very, very few kids who haven't had something in their life. But one of you was talking about this to me the other day, and I don't remember who it was, but if you are 10 and you have been removed from your caretaker and had completely disrupted attachment experiences from the age of 5 until you are now placed in an adoptive home at the age of 10, where do you think you left off in terms of learning how to interact with a caretaker? This is really hard for adoptive parents because you've now adopted a 10-year-old and you think, well, you know, a 10-year-old should be acting in a certain way, but 10-year-olds who have been neglected or traumatized for the first several years of their life are not going to attach normally. They're not going to bond normally. It's going to take a while. And a lot of times what we say to our adoptive parents is, okay, he's 10, but he's probably around like a 4-year-old emotional level. I think maybe Carol and I, maybe you and I were talking about this, because that was where he left off. So that's what you got to do. You got to recognize that that's where they are. Oh, now I know. I do remember having that conversation with Carol. Sometimes I'll say, oh, I talked to somebody, but I don't know who it was. So, all right, let's talk about reactive attachment disorder and why we don't use it. We don't use reactive attachment disorder ever for our kids, because if you look in the DSM or the DC 0 to 5, because they're both in there, they both say this is a very rare diagnosis and it is rarely used. I don't even know why they keep putting it in the DSMs, because if you look at what you have to qualify for reactive attachment disorder, it's almost impossible to meet that diagnosis. However, every kid that comes into foster care has got disordered attachment. That is not the same thing as reactive attachment disorder. It is an interruption, and that's our job, to work on the interruption. And let me see where we are, because I need to give you guys a break. Let me just, okay, why don't I, because I don't want you to fall asleep on me. It's 10:20. Can we take a 10-minute break and you can grab your coffee or do whatever you need to do? And we'll start again at 10:30. How is that for everybody?
That's good.
That's good. Thank you.
All
Very
right.
Sounds
trying to find the,
It's good for me.
okay,
Good for me as well.
10 minutes, right?
yep.
Let's go. Get that coffee.
Okay, I think we're about ready to get going again. If you guys can come back. All right, just for my records, because I see Yanira has joined us. I have, in terms of training hours, Carol Parham, Bonnie, Carol D'Angelo, Derek, Faith, Eileen, Dylan, Elizabeth, Marcia, and Yanira. Did I miss anybody? And then I have our 3 guests from the GAL's office. Okay, let's get going again. Hold on. I think there's somebody else I need to let in here. All right, I think I've let everybody back in that might have gone someplace, so. Okay, we're gonna move into kind of some specific play therapy techniques and talk about some of that. So let me just finish up this piece of it. So if you have a young child that has lost their caretaker in an early age, you are going to have all of these things affected. And that doesn't mean you can't remediate them. That's the thing I want you to always keep in mind. And the reason I say that, Faith, are you in? Kind of looks like you need to mute your mic. Faith was having trouble out there in the training room getting her connection up, so. With any of the things that we're talking about, you can help remediate some of this. The fact that these children have been affected by the loss of caretaker in their early years does not mean that we cannot remediate it. But when I was studying to get my master's, the thinking about reactive attachment disorder is it was not possible to that conscious development was irrevocably damaged, and that you would never be able to develop a conscience, you'd never be able to be kind, you'd never be able to love. And that is why the whole for adoptive parents, if adoptive parents see reactive attachment disorder in a child's file, it's like the kiss of death, because for many people that are lay people, they have been taught some of these fallacies, and they have been taught that children can't get better, and that is absolutely not true. But the ability to analyze danger seems kind of silly, but these kids absolutely do not know when they need to not get into the road in front of an 18-wheeler. They don't know that there is danger there. I think specifically doing some of my work with Florida United and watching those kids do some of the things that they did that absolutely put them in danger, because they couldn't think logically. It didn't occur to them that getting into a car or getting into a truck with a truck driver after they had run out the front gates was going to put them in any danger. Our kids have had all of these things affected. They don't have a lot of stress tolerance. We talked before about the inability to regulate. They don't know how to soothe themselves. But most importantly, they just don't know how to form attachments. They don't know that they can be loved. They don't know that they can form attachments with a caretaker. So what are we looking at neurologically? Why does this happen neurologically? Because trauma is going to imprint itself in the implicit memory of the brain. When we do the brain training and we talk about the amygdala and the brainstem, the amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex, the brainstem is where the basic living skills and basic life skills are inherent. The ability to breathe, the ability to swallow, the ability to poop, the ability to do anything like that. That's just part of the brainstem. But as we begin to have traumatic events happen to us, they get stored in the midbrain. They get stored in the amygdala. And that often means that the kids that you're working with that are now older, who have all the symptoms of traumatic events happening to them, don't remember them. And you have a really hard time helping them to unlock some of those memories and feel safe again, which is why we're going to talk about some of the expressive therapies. For those of you who have been trained in EMDR, it is a wonderful, wonderful technique. And it is a wonderful technique for unlocking, the simplest way we can say it, you're unlocking the memory that is stored in your amygdala and putting it up here where you can access it and say, oh, that happened to me. That happened to me, but that was then, this is now, and now I'm safe. But if it stays locked in the amygdala and you can't access it, it's always in the here and now. It's always something that these kids implicitly think is right there and it's going to affect them again. So if you have a chance to do EMDR training, it's gotten much cheaper than it used to be. And it's a wonderful technique. Why? Because trauma is going to cause the brain to believe that trouble is coming. And the other thing that happens neurologically in the brain is that every time you have something scary happen to you, say you're driving down I-4, which would be a daily experiment in terror, and you see people coming towards you and they're coming around you, and which is why I hate being on I-4. Every time that happens, your cortisol level in your brain goes up. It makes you hypervigilant. It makes you react to trouble. The cortisol level is a very important thing. It makes you say, oh, I better get out of this guy's way. He's coming right up at me and he's going to hit my back end. So you move. But then when it's over, the cortisol level comes back down again and you're okay again. The problem with our children is that they have daily doses of trauma. They have daily doses of fear. They have daily doses of things that frighten them. So their cortisol level goes up and then it comes down a little. Then it goes up again, then it comes down a little. It goes up again, and eventually it doesn't come back down. If you look and did blood work on a lot of these kids, their cortisol levels are very high. They're high because they just don't get calmed down enough for it to come down and stay down. And that's why kids in foster care and kids in group care are always so hypervigilant. They're always looking around for trouble because they have that heightened sense of cortisol. And the other problem with heightened cortisol levels is it does kill developing brain cells. And lastly, we have kids, as their cortisol level goes up, their serotonin level goes down. So serotonin is that lovely part of the hormone in your body that makes you feel safe and warm. And these kids have heightened cortisol, there's danger. They have decreased serotonin, there's no peace and calm. And they always put this little thing in here about children of Iraq, because now we could say children of Afghanistan, children of the Ukraine, children of any one of the North places, children of Turkey, that when you are in a state of continuous danger, eventually it's either going to kill you or you're just going to learn how to ignore it. And we see kids that are, it's always amazing if you look at some of the news footage of some of the stuff that's happening in Turkey after that hurricane or after that earthquake, or in the Ukraine or in Afghanistan or any places where there is constant danger. You also see children playing because they've just gotten so used to it that that has become their life. So We've learned the effects of trauma on the brain is that these kids are in a constant state of trauma or stress. We've learned that constant trauma is going to alter the brain. We've learned that kids are going to be hypervigilant all the time. They're not going to be able to self-regulate. And what happens when you're hypervigilant? What happens when you are in your third grade class and your teacher is trying to calm the other kids down because they're noisy, because it's Monday morning and she's saying, class, I need you to calm down. I need you to be quiet. And then eventually she loses her temper and says, I need you all to be quiet. What happens to that kid that's sitting there hypervigilant and afraid? That kid is going to sense danger. That kid is not going to say the teacher's really aggravated with us and we better be quiet. That kid is going to sense danger. And that kid is going to be hypervigilant. And that's the kid that's going to get triggered. And then he gets triggered and then he gets upset. And then the teacher has to send him to the office because she says he's acting up. So it's a constant loop. And the other thing that we don't always focus on is that when you are constantly subjected to trauma in the brain, your immune system goes down. You're going to have a decreased immune system. And that's just, I'm talking about things like asthma or allergies or frequent colds or any of those things. The ACE test has absolutely proven to us that you have a decreased immune system as you get older. And if you look at all of our kids, almost all of our kids have got something wrong with them. They either have allergies, or they have diabetes or pre-diabetes, or they've got asthma, or they're obese, or they have frequent colds. And that is why when we are working with our adoptive parents and they're getting ready to bring this child into their home, and they want to put that child on their Blue Cross because they want to claim that child as their own, why do we say to them, don't do that? Leave this kid on the Sunshine Child Welfare Plan, because the Sunshine Child Welfare Plan is geared to working with kids with decreased immune systems. It's used to having to approve all kinds of tests and different things for children who are much sicker than the average population. And that's just a practical reality that we try to say to adoptive parents. Whoops, I think I hit that. Okay, so basically speaking, what has happened in the baby brain is that stuck in their survival state, they're going to say, am I safe? But this is where everything is stuck. Everything is stuck in this little blue section, which is called the amygdala. And in this section, we have all of the emotions of trauma and fear and memories that we can't access. So basically, we say the amygdala is just saying, am I safe and do you love me? The reason we never get up here to the problem solving stage is because that part of the brain is just not developed yet. And that's why we're going to talk about expressive therapies. That if you are working with a child who has been removed, who is triggered, who is having all kinds of fears, who doesn't feel safe, they're not going to be able to utilize this part of their brain until you can help them understand that you're here to make them feel safe and this is the way we're going to do it. Once you do that, yeah, you can go back to cognitive behavioral therapy if that's your wheelhouse. And let me move this. Whoops. Hold on a second. I think I just screwed myself up here. So what are you going to do as therapists? What can you as therapists do with these kids? Well, the very first thing you can do is to try to educate caregivers about what happens to these kids when their brains have been traumatized. And when I say under stress, the thinking brain shuts down and the feeling brain takes over, you really got to explain that to foster parents or adoptive parents, because they don't understand that. And the very first thing adoptive parents do over and over and over again is to tell us that these kids could do much better in school and that they're just not applying themselves. And why is that such a common theme with adoptive parents? For one thing, adoptive parents they want the best for their kids, don't they? That's why they're adopting. They want this child to succeed in life. And most adoptive parents believe that the key to success is education, is to doing well in school. Now, why is this difficult for adoptive parents? Because when you sit down with an adoptive parent and say, you know what, it took him 9 years to get this way, and it's going to take him more than 9 days to begin to feel safe and to begin to get that executive function up and running. And in the meantime, he is going to be operating on that feeling brain level. And you trying to say to him, you know, you're not applying yourself, you're not thinking, you need to sit down, you need to do your homework. This child's brain is not ready for that. And you need to help caregivers to respond to triggers instead of behaviors. If you go on our Circle of Friends YouTube channel, the very first thing we did when we set that channel up was to set up a playlist of little 15-minute segments for adoptive parents. And it's all about what we can do to help you be successful with your adoption. And one of them is, why is my child so detached? Why does my child act like this? Why does my child not respond when I try to get him to do his homework? It's all kind of simple stuff. And the reason that we started with that is that we hear all this stuff all the time, don't we? Especially from adoptive parents, that they don't understand that when the child is triggered by a memory that he can't access, that child is just reacting. That child is just triggered. That child isn't necessarily thinking, okay, when he just tapped me on the shoulder, that didn't mean he wanted to have sex with me. That was something that my father did. Those are triggers. Triggers are not cognitive memories. They're just reactions. And helping parents or foster parents or relative caregivers to understand that is important. So when I say, I had a hair trigger temper here. When I say what kind of treatment works best, it may not be what you think. And the reason that we go through all of this is that if your emotional regulation is stuck here in this limbic stage, if you are just, you're reacting to the fears and the traumas of what happened to you before, but you don't actively remember them, you're not going to be able to get into the thinking part of your brain to let all of that benefit. So we try to do a lot of experiential stuff. When we first open up kids, some of this will come. You'll be able to encourage them to remember, to have abstract thought, to be able to be cognitive about what happened, to be able to be rational about what happened after you've regulated them emotionally. And that's where play therapy comes in. And that's why it's so important. So what kind of, well, hold on, I got somebody else I need to look back in, sorry. What kind of treatments address trauma triggers the best? When we start with any of our kids, we usually start with the experiential treatment modalities. So we're going to start with play therapy, sand tray, music, maybe reading them books. Now, how did we adjust to this during the pandemic? It wasn't easy. And it probably wasn't as effective as doing it in front of them, where they could hear you breathing and you could hear them breathing and you could be right in the moment and you could make eye contact. Any of you who have tried to do this on telemedicine know that it's really hard with young children to get them to maintain that eye contact. For one thing, it depends on how good your camera is. It depends on what's going on in the room around them, that they don't have the same lock on you that they do when you're sitting in front of them. But what did we do? We tried to adapt, didn't we? We tried to do virtual sand tray. We tried to do virtual dollhouse. We did virtual puppet theater. We had all kinds of interventions. And the books, we have tons of playlists on our YouTube channel with all of the books that we were letting you borrow from our clinical libraries. We had to find those books on YouTube and save them into playlists on the Circle of Friends YouTube channel so that you could have some access to those activities. But and I know that we have at least one person on here who was very successful with telemedicine, but probably it's the population that he's working with. For those of us who are working with younger children, the play therapies, the in-person therapies are always going to be just more effective for you. EMDR, as we said, it's a wonderful technique for unlocking trauma triggers. Brain spotting, I spent 6 hours trying to go through a training on brain spotting, and I still don't understand it. But if any of you are interested in it, it has something to do with the corpus callosum, and somehow getting right into that part of the brain. If any of you want to go on and then you can tell me what brain spotting is, I'd be very happy, but I spent 6 hours on it and I still don't know. But it is supposed to be good for addressing trauma triggers. I'll just put it there. Clinical hypnosis is a wonderful technique. It is a technique in Florida that you may not use unless you are certified. But if you have an interest in it and you want to get certified in it, it is a wonderful technique to use. Unlike EMDR is an intervention. You don't have to be certified in it. You don't have to be, quote, certified in a lot of these things. You don't have to be certified in sand tray or play therapy or art or any of these things. They're interventions. And if you want to get a certification in any of them, absolutely do it. But it is not something that should stop you from using one of these techniques. And lastly, the emotional freedom technique is really just a little, there's a lot of tapping. One of the playlists on our channel is neurological interventions, and they're cute little videos about the tapping. The emotional freedom technique involves tapping on acupuncture points and saying, I'm whatever you say to calm yourself, but they have very specific tapping technique. And it's just kind of fun, and you can learn it. We have a little book here for kids about learning how to tap your way to emotional freedom. Those are the kind of things you can do. You can do them on telemedicine. They're easier to do in person. We have found over time that yoga is a really great thing for calming kids down, and kids like to do it. We, at one point at the beginning of the pandemic, I got a little donation and I bought like 25 packs of armchair yoga and mailed them out to people because I had the money. But armchair yoga, you could sit in front of your screen, and the kid could be on the screen, and you could do the yoga things from your chair together, and that was kind of fun. Now, what's the neurological benefit of that? Yoga calms people down. The whole purpose of yoga is to kind of regulate and calm people down and get them to a safe spot. I don't think we'll have time to show it today, but we have a book. It's a wonderful book, and it's on YouTube in our playlist, called Good Night Yoga. And it is a wonderful, the narrator narrates all the poses, and it's set to music, and it's very zen-y, and it's very calming. And a lot of the therapists were using Good Night Yoga because this was before our Circle of Friends playlist. They were finding it on YouTube and downloading it and using it with their kids, and talking about how if they had a kid that was really bouncing off the walls and they would start their session with Good Night Yoga, by the time they got done, that child was pretty well regulated and could get through the session. So we have that, and a lot of kids react to exercise. One of the other videos that we have used was Carol, what is the name of the one that we used where she was doing the breathing? I can't even think of what it is right now. But she did she was doing the breathing to teach kids that were really hyped up how to calm down. The name will come to me in a minute, but it's an exercise video. So I guess what I want you to do is kind of look and see, none of this has anything to do with talking, does it? It has nothing to do with talking. It has to do with experiencing something in the moment with a child where you can be connected, you can make eye contact, you can be present for that child, you can be calming, and you can help that child pair a pleasant, relaxing activity with wherever he's trying to get to in terms of remembering his trauma. Now I'm going to be crazy until I can remember what the name of that video is. So how do these address your triggers? When we talk about the sympathetic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system is your feeling brain. And when you are triggered, you are triggering your sympathetic nervous system. When you are in an automobile accident, or you see a car coming right towards you, or you know that there's danger, you see a dog coming at you. I've always been afraid of dogs. So when I see a dog coming at me, my sympathetic nervous system goes right up through the roof. It's just the way people have been raised, the experiences that you've had, the things that have triggered you. So the experiential modalities are going to deactivate the sympathetic nervous system, and they're going to allow your parasympathetic to reactivate. And that's why we say sympathetic is fight or flight, and parasympathetic is rest and digest. You want to get your kids to the state where their parasympathetic nervous system takes over, and they are feeling safe, they are feeling calm, they are feeling like they can be regulated. But that's where some of these activities come from. That's why we build our playrooms the way we do. We have a play therapy room in all of our offices. Carol doesn't have a ton of room in hers, but she's got a whole bunch of stuff in there. She's got a little kitchen. She's got art activities. She's got toys. She has a huge clinical library out in the break room. We have actually it's a big room here where we have room for the puppet theater. We have room for the sand tray. We have room for the kitchen. We have room for all of these activities that will allow a kid to just come in, draw, play. Maybe we have televisions, maybe watch a little YouTube. But the whole purpose of all of these is to really just get kids to calm down. Breath of joy, breath of joy. That's the video that I'm trying to remember. If you Google breath of joy, it's also on our playlist. Breath of joy is a fabulous activity for just doing a lot of yoga breathing that help kids who are kind of like all hyped up to kind of calm down. And the little yoga instructor is very cute too. I knew I would remember that. Okay, once you've done all these things, once you have got everybody calm down, and once you've got the parasympathetic nervous system online and everybody is feeling safe and warm and loved, now if you want to talk to them at this point, now you can. This is when you can use any of the modalities that require the thinking brain to be activated, but you can't do it until you calm them down. Those of you who have come to our Gentry training, the training that allows you to get the certified clinical trauma professional, the 10 ways of dealing with PTSD and stress and trauma. Eric Gentry is very clear, and he repeats it over and over again, that you cannot perceive threat in a relaxed body. That's his mantra. What does that mean? That means that if you are trying to work with someone who has those locked memories of fear and trauma, and they can't access them, for them, that fear and trauma and whatever happened is right there present. And you cannot work with them until you get them to relax, which is why he says you cannot perceive threat in a relaxed body. A lot of what Gentry talks about doing is doing all these things that get people calm so that they can believe that they can be helped. You can do TFCPT. Everybody does TFCPT. You can do rational emotive therapy. You can do dialectical behavioral therapy, motivational interviewing. A lot of people use motivational interviewing with kids that are a little bit older, but they all require your thinking brain to be activated. So if you're trying to sit and talk with somebody and assess where they are in the pre-contemplation stage and all of that jazz from motivational interviewing, and in the back of their mind, they're thinking, okay, I don't know why I feel so scared, but she's really making me nervous. They're not going to be reacting. You've got to do the first steps first. So let's go over the different kinds of expressive therapies. Now, this is an overview, you guys. And for those of you who are a little bit new, and I know I have a lot of my veterans on here, but if there's anything that you want to learn more about, this is an overview of all of these techniques. If there are things that you want to learn more about, there's all kinds of access on the internet now. There's all kinds of access to videos, to YouTube. YouTube is a treasure trove of information, and you can learn more about all this stuff. But we want you to know that these are your tools, and you're not just, as the foster parents are fond of saying, you're not just playing with them. You have a purpose in what you're doing. Just wait for my cuckoo clock to go off because I can't hear over it. And I just spilled coffee on myself. Okay, why does play help children? And you have to, the reason I go over this slide is that if the foster mom says to you, all you did was play with him, you need to be able to explain what you were doing. So if you don't know what you were doing, how do you expect her to know what you were doing? What we really see with children, and it's like I said, the kids in Afghanistan and Iraq that are in the middle of a bombed building and they're playing, children communicate through play. And they communicate through the way they develop play. They communicate the kind of toys that they choose, the kind of fantasies that they create. And if you can join in that communication with them, you can learn a lot about their world, because you got to go where their world is, and their world is in play. You're going to develop a therapeutic relationship if you play with them, which is one of the simplest things that you tell young parents to do. And sometimes it's the hardest thing for young parents to do, is to play with their children. If you have especially a young parent who hasn't had much caretaking themselves, and you have them in the play therapy room, and you say, okay, why don't we just play for about 10 minutes? Let's get down on the floor and play. You can always tell the parents who've never had that experience themselves. And you can tell the parents that feel self-conscious, who don't know what to do. And then you have the parents who the child immediately picks up a doctor's kit and starts to play and says, I'm gonna listen to your heart. I'm gonna listen to your blood pressure. I'm gonna listen to your pulse. And the parent immediately says, let's do that. Here's where my heart is. Parents who are used to communicating through play will do much better than this. It's also a good assessment tool for you if you're working with a young parent and a child, to see whether or not they can actually do it, because sometimes they're just very self-conscious about it. But you need to be able to say to the skeptical caretaker, there's a reason that I'm doing this, that this is the way children communicate. And this is, I'm watching what kind of toys they pick up. I'm watching what they're doing. I'm watching what kind of fantasy play that they're developing, and I'm joining with them. And that's the way I join in that relationship. Now, what is the difference between unstructured and structured? Simply put, unstructured play therapy for different people, for me, it would be the hardest thing to do, because it is very unstructured. When we had Amy Inatelli here, for those of you who remember Amy was a certified play therapist, and she was absolutely sold on the fact that the only kind of play therapy that one should do was unstructured therapy. Unstructured therapy just allows the child to form the play themselves. And the child-centered play therapist is supposed to be very intentional about watching what they're doing. I can tell you that Amy went through a whole training when we still were in the other building, a whole training on structured and unstructured play therapy. And she got all the way to the end and said, well, this is how you do structured and this is how you do unstructured. And one of the therapists got all the way done and said, well, what do I do now? Because unstructured is just, it takes a skilled person to do it, because you're not doing as much. With structured, we're more used to that. With structured, you're going to plan the activity. You might say, okay, with unstructured, you might say, well, you can pick anything in the room that you like to play with here today. And with structured, you might say, okay, well, today we're going to play Jenga. Or today we are going to draw some pictures. So the difference between structured and unstructured is just that you are going to either let the child play the activity or you're going to plan the activity. Melissa, this is your playroom. You can play with any of the toys that you want. You let the child lead. The child can pick the activities that he wants. With structured, you're going to plan the activity. Now, there's a place for each one of these, especially in the beginning. You may find it a good assessment tool for those of you who use structured or unstructured. If you have a child who just can't pick an activity, who we had one young lad, his name was Micah, and he was only 4, and he had been pretty severely traumatized by his mom, who had some pretty serious mental health issues, and he had been placed with an older couple who were going to adopt him, but they hadn't told him that. So there was a lot wrong with this whole picture. But Micah just could not pick an activity. This was Amy's client. She would go out and she would lay out the toys and he would just sit frozen. He just wouldn't pick anything. And we talked a lot about how she could help him. And she was at the daycare center. And, you know, if you go to a daycare center, the little boys will ignore you, but man, those little girls, they'll be all over you. And the little girl comes in, Micah's sitting there staring at the toys. And the little girl said to Amy, "What is he doing?" And she said, "He's playing." And the little girl said, "It doesn't look like it to me." So we eventually said, well, maybe we could use a little girl as your co-therapist. You could have her pick an activity and maybe he'll play. But eventually we got past it with Micah. But those are the biggest differences. And there's a lot more to unstructured. There's tracking and modeling activities. Tracking is a big part of that. It's just saying, oh, now you're doing this and now you're doing that. And it's really just to tell the child that you're attending to what he's doing. But there's a lot of good articles. If you want to learn more about one or the other, you certainly can. I always save this picture because this was our play therapy room in Deltona. And this is a good example of unstructured play therapy gone wild. This was a very small room to begin with, but this was a sibling group of 3. They were 3 little thugs. They were small and they got into the room and the therapist said, well, you can pick whatever activity you want. Well, her first problem was that she had 3 of them in there, so that wasn't good. And the second problem was that they just sort of spiraled up. They were not used to having that much freedom. And they just really spiraled up quickly and pretty much destroyed this room. And this was partially cleaned up when I took this picture, but it took 3 of us to go down there to clean this up. They emptied out all the drawers. They took all the puzzles and games and dumped them all over the floor. And what was happening in their minds? I mean, we did eventually get some remediation out of this after I had to give the therapist therapy. But I think the lesson that I tried to help her to see was these kids were not used to being able to do anything like this. And it created such anxiety for them that they just completely destroyed the room. They also lived in a house that had very few rules. The dad was away, the mom was home alone a lot with them. She had very little control over them. So this kind of unbridled freedom created so much anxiety in them that they just destroyed the room. So therapeutic limit setting means that when you need them, you have to use them. Even in unstructured, there are times when you have to use limit setting. And why are we doing this with trauma? Because kids who have experienced trauma are going to reenact it in some way if they have the freedom to do it. It doesn't have to be in this kind of therapy. It can be in some of the other things that we're going to go over. But the reason we use play therapy for kids that are traumatized is that sometimes they just don't have access or words for what's happened to them. And you will see kids build things in sand trays, draw things in pictures, do things when they create stories that will show that they have some kind of a memory that they're trying to access. The other thing I would say is that this can be a little slow work, and the play therapists have this saying of trust the process. Play therapists tend to be extremely patient people, and when they say trust the process, for those of us who are kind of used to getting in there and doing an activity and seeing some results and how did they react to it, this can be a very slow process. But it is also the way in which very young children can access their memories. So you have to trust that it will eventually work.
Barbara, can I share an experience with that?
Absolutely.
This was a few years back. I had a sibling group, and I was meeting with them individually. There was some abuse in the home, and even as far as sexual improprieties, and they believe taking videos or pictures of the kids. The little boy that I had, when I would meet with him, he would always sit underneath the table because that's where he felt safe. He wanted to play there. So that's where I sat on the floor with him, let him be under the table, and I was just at his level with eyesight. And this happened weeks and weeks, and it just, kept going. I didn't get any information from him until one day he was looking in the toy box, and he found a pair of handcuffs. And with the handcuffs, he got really excited. Took the handcuff, slapped it on his wrist, and then slapped it to the chair, the other end. And I asked him, what was happening, what was he feeling? And then he proceeded to say, this is what my mom did, pulled down my pants, took pictures, kind of thing. So, which I then immediately called in to the abuse hotline, and things played out the way they should have. But if the handcuffs wouldn't have been in that play box, I probably never would have found that information out.
Yeah, I remember that story. I remember you telling me that. It also kind of brings up another point that it isn't part of this, but if you're going to resume in person, and you can't do it without stuff. We interviewed somebody the other day who said, I don't see young children because I don't have any stuff. One of our videos on the playlist tells you what to put in a play therapy kit. And a lot of people have Tupperware containers in their trunk where they have all the stuff that they need to have. And in the playlist, it goes over what you need for a play therapy kit, what you should have for a play therapy kit. It also goes over what you should have for a sand tray, because it's fairly regulated what you need to have. And a lot of therapists would not think about that, but handcuffs are one of the things that you should have. You should have some of the things that would maybe trigger a memory. One of them is a cigarette. One of them is a bottle of liquor, a tombstone. There's a lot of things that are on, trying to think of what the name of the website is that we get all the sand tray. I'll think of it in a minute, but it has all those very specific things on it that you can buy for your sand tray. You always have to have certain things for sand tray or for play. And things like the handcuffs are one of those things. I don't know that people always think, oh, I don't want to trigger bad memories. Well, Carol could have been sitting there forever with that kid without that memory. So that's kind of what we're trying to do. Toys of the trade. See, my memory will not let me access things until it's gone. It's called Toys of the Trade, and it's toysofthetrade.com. And you can go on Toys of the Trade, and you can order a lot of stuff. It's not expensive. When we were setting up our sand trays, we always had to have certain things that only we could buy on Toys of the Trade before Toys R Us went out. you could get some of this stuff at Halloween because there are different times of the year. But you always have to have babies. You always have to have army figures. You have to have aggressive figures. You have to have nurturing figures. You have to have things like volcanoes or trees, or there's all kinds of things that you would want to have in your kits. And Toys of the Trade is a good source for that. So just as Carol is talking about, kids are going to act out traumatic memories. Sometimes they do it without any prompting. Sometimes we do need to prompt them. But we have to be able to determine through the play if they are working towards remediation or if they're stuck. And that's why I say, is it dynamic play or toxic play? And that's one of the things that we're going to talk about. When you're assessing a child's play, you need to be patient for one thing, because sometimes they can be stuck in one spot for a while. But if you're assessing, are they moving towards remediation? That's pretty important, because that's dynamic play. If they're just stuck in the trauma, then we have to help move them along. That's toxic play. Some of you have seen these pictures before. This is an old picture. And all the therapist did in this particular situation, this was a 9-year-old girl, and she was at the foster home. She asked her to draw a picture. That was her only instruction. Go on to draw me a picture. And this, you can get some amazing things if all you say to a child is, why don't you draw me a picture? Because the things that children draw, I have a whole folder of things that children have drawn for me that I go, oh my God, that's what happened. But this kid had been involved in a DV accident, and it's kind of hard to see, but this was her. It says me. She was crying because her mother is in this window, and her mother has blood on her chest because John, who was over here, had broken a beer bottle on her chest. And this little girl had called the police. This was a few years ago, before people seemed to be afraid of the police the way they are now, which is sad. But this was all these details to me were amazing. This is the policeman going to the door to arrest John. This is the cruiser with the lights on. This is she asked what this was. And this was another law enforcement officer who had a taser, and he was going to tase John. But all of these details, and I'm sure we can assign some significance to the stars in the sky and the moon and hope, not hope, whatever. And if you're into art therapy is a fascinating thing, because if you really could get into art therapy, art therapists have evidence-based what is wrong if the door is like this, if the windows are like this, if there's no windows, if there's smoke coming out of the chimneys, all kinds of things you can look for. But in this particular situation, you didn't have to go very far. She was drawing a picture of her removal, and she was scared. But what she remembered were all the sensory memories. She remembered the blood. She was very quick to point out that this was a siren and that it made a lot of noise. And that it was nighttime, and that she was scared, and that the policemen were coming with the tasers. The good luck was that John was arrested. The bad luck was that she was removed from her mother. Oops. Okay, post-traumatic play is it's gradual exposure to what happened to them. So let it happen. If it happens, you're going to, at least as Carol finally figured out what was going on with the kid. It isn't something you don't want to stop it. You want to let it go on. And it allows children to gradually get to where they're trying to get to. But you do have to have benchmarks for what you're doing. We want you all to be kind and nurturing and caring when you're doing something. We also want you to know theoretically what you're doing while you're doing it. So if any of you would like this handout, I have this handout. I believe this is from it's a book. What's her name? Art therapist. This might be Kathy Melchiati. I'm not sure. I have the book. But there's a difference between dynamic post-traumatic play and toxic post-traumatic play. And what you're looking for with dynamic post-traumatic play is that as they go on, as they draw the pictures, as they do the sand tray, as they act out play therapy scenarios, that they're beginning to get better, that they're seeing safety emerging, that they're seeing that they're beginning to feel some release as they share with you what happened. Where it gets stuck is if they don't ever see any kind of an adaptive outcome. If you have, I think I have some sand tray pictures here. If you have a child who continually builds a sand tray week after week after week, where he identifies the baby, there's always a baby in a sand tray kit, and he buries the baby, and he tells you week after week that nobody is coming, and we have had this happen with a couple of our kids. Nobody's coming to save the baby. See, there's all kinds of aggressive figures around the baby. There's gorillas and there's dinosaurs and there's all kinds of scary things and lions, but nobody is coming to save the baby. In this particular situation, this boy did this week after week after week, and he wasn't seeing any safety. He was building a world in which a baby was being killed, and he wasn't able to say, well, how can I get out of this? And that's the difference between dynamic and post and toxic. And again, this is a handout that I have. If anybody wants it, all you have to do is email me and I can send it out. It's very helpful. But what do we do with post-traumatic play? Whether it doesn't matter what you're doing. It doesn't matter if you're doing puppets, if you're doing sand tray, if you're doing a dollhouse. It doesn't matter what you're doing. But if you see a kid who is stuck in some kind of toxic play, what you have to do, I don't care how much you like unstructured play therapy, you have to take over at this point. Because if you see a kid who's stuck, that's a kid who either has never seen release at the end, or doesn't know how to get there, or doesn't have anybody that he trusts to get him there. So say you have the kid who's burying the baby. You could say, you could begin to model some questions. You could do the wonder out loud question. I wonder what would happen if a policeman came in and rescued the baby. I wonder what would happen if this dinosaur in this corner became a protector to the baby and came over and unburied him. I wonder what would happen if somebody would come in and save him. You have to change the narrative, and you got to be able to say, what do you think would happen if this got better? So you're switching, if you're doing unstructured work, you're going to switch to structured. You're going to be able to say, this is how we can get out of this. You have to model that for kids. And generally speaking, that's going to turn it around pretty quickly. Because generally speaking, if you think about this, if you've got an 8 or a 9-year-old, or like Carol's kid, and you're finally saying, this is what happened, you're looking for somebody to help you out of this. You're a kid, and you're looking for somebody to say, I haven't had any adults in my life try to protect me, so how can I get out of this? So it is okay for you to try to take the lead. Okay, this is another structured activity that you can use. This is a very well-established tool. This is a genogram, and it's an easy thing for you to use. You can just draw the genogram on a big piece of construction paper or whatever and put it on the ground. If you're going to use this technique, you have to have, this is all done with animals. There's no people in this. So you're going to have, we usually used to carry like bags of little play animals, and then put them all out there and let the child choose the miniature that you're going to say, where are you? Okay, I'm right here. I'm this little cat. Kids like to be cats for some reason. I'm this little cat over here. And then you might say, okay, here are a bunch of miniatures. Which one would be the other members of your family, and they can pick, all right, this is my dad, this is my uncle, this is my brother, this is my mom. And then you can say, why don't you show me who's close to the little cat? And then they can show you where different family members are. Now, in this particular situation, if this, and it's hard to see what these things are, but if you had a dad that was abusive and you're over here and you put that dad as far away from you as you can, or you put this person, this is your older sister who took care of you. Sometimes we have kids that take the abusive figure and they put him out here someplace. He's not even on a piece of paper. So it's a really good diagnostic. It's a really good way to see where kids are, but you don't ever have to say, are you the cat? Is this your older sister? You always stay in the metaphor with any of these things. And why do you stay in the metaphor? Because it's safer. If you begin to say, okay, is that cat you? And why is your dad, who's the elephant, why is he way out here? Now you're out of the metaphor. Metaphors are safer, just stay in them. Having said that, if you have a kid who says, you know, this is me, then that kid is choosing to break the metaphor, but you're going to maintain some safety. And this is my very famous critter genogram. I was doing this training and one of the therapists said, I just did this and I took a picture of it. So she went out to get the picture and we put it up on the screen. And this is just the best. This is just the best critter genogram because these two, she was working with an adoptive family. And these two little birds, the white bird and the blue bird over here, were the sibling group that were going to be adopted. I can't make my mouse work. This was the sibling group. And they were going to be adopted by these people over here. These are the adoptive parents. Now, what you have to understand about this is that the adoptive parents were white and these children were Hispanic. And they put this genogram together and very quickly told with Judy, she's retired now, they put all this jumble, these are all jumbled together. And this is all these animals. And Judy said, well, what is all this? And she said, well, when I lived at home with my mom and dad, we lived in a neighborhood and every night, everybody came out and had this big party and everybody was together. And now in the house we live in, there's no people. Now, was that necessarily true? Not necessarily, but it was this child's memory. And this child's memory, I mean, what would you get out of that? What Judy got out of it, and thankfully what the adoptive parents got out of it, was that there's a big difference between the Hispanic culture and some Caucasian cultures. And these were very quiet people. They didn't have a lot of family. And they were trying to make these little girls feel comfortable. But what they really learned was that in these kids' minds, and the sisters built this together, and Judy said it took them about 5 minutes, but in their minds, this was the family they were leaving behind. This was the family that they were never going to see again. And this was the family that they were losing after the adoption. Basically, it was the culture that they were losing. And the good part of all this is that the adoption ended up being successful because the adoptive parents were open to what they were trying to show them. We could have been working with these people for months before we got to this point. What we probably would have had would have been the kids would have been acting up and the parents didn't know why, and efforts to kind of make them happy wouldn't have worked because this was a very quiet family. But they quickly kind of got, not only were there a lot of figures here, but they were chaotic, they were jumbled together, and this was their collective memory. So at least Judy then had something to work with. So there's a lot of ways that you can use some of these tools, and they're really very simple. The outline drawings, you can go to Michael's and buy the little white cutouts of the boys and the girls. I think you can also do them at, I think you can get them at the dollar stores too. They're pretty cheap. but again, you can stay in therapeutic distance with these techniques too. You can put the little boy down, you can put the little girl down. You can say, let's talk about this little boy, or let's talk about this little girl. Where might this little girl be feeling anger? Where might this little girl be feeling sadness? Okay, let's pick a color that matches sadness. Let's pick a color that matches anger, and let's color it in. And you can always do that without having to say, how do you feel about this? How do you feel about while you're angry? And I hope you're getting a theme here, that with a lot of play therapy techniques, you're always staying in a metaphor. You're always allowing kids to access what they're feeling without saying it's them. And I hope I'm explaining that correctly. That's a pretty easy thing to use. I think those little cutouts, you can usually get them like in packages of 10, and they're like little hard cardboard. And Michael's used to have them, Toys R Us used to have them, and I think the dollar store has them. The bibliotherapy, we have, Carol has got a huge clinical library in Bradenton. For those of you who go over to that office, we have a huge one here. And when we get our Kissimmee office back opened again, where it's under construction, we'll have it there too. Now, obviously, what happened during the pandemic is that you guys couldn't come in anymore and borrow the books, because we have, like here, and I think Carol's done it the same way, we have a clinical library and we have all the shelves marked. These are books about foster care, these are books about adoption, these are books about sexual trauma. And Carol's is really cute because she's got little toys in it too to make it adorable. But the therapist would come in for group supervision and they would borrow the books. And then next group supervision, they bring them back again. We had a little lending library. And we always tried to do it this way because you guys may not have a lot of this stuff or may not have the money to invest in all this stuff. So we've always tried to do this for you. Well, what happened during the pandemic is that none of you were coming in anymore. So that's when we began to expand the Circle of Friends channel. And if you go on it, and I really wish that you would use it because we have all worked very hard on it, we have all kinds of playlists on there with different books, children's books that we have put into different categories. We have a lot of interventions. We've got a human trafficking one. We've got a one on school shooting, just a whole lot of stuff. So we also have all the clinical trainings. That's why I record these, because once I record them, then I put them into our clinical playlist so that if you want to go back in and access them afterwards, you certainly can. But most children's books, if you look at the children's books that we have, they don't talk about people. They always talk about animals. And when I say Walt Disney, none of Walt Disney's characters had mothers, did they? I mean, even Nemo's mother got swallowed up, for God's sakes. I mean, Bambi's mother was killed. Dumbo's mother was taken away. If ever there was a time we were going to cry, it was when Dumbo's mother was taken away. They're all like this. And believe it or not, Walt Disney took a lot of these things from Grimm's fairy tales, and there was nothing child friendly about Grimm's fairy tales. But a lot of the way he has done, or he did do this, was to create vulnerable characters. And most of the books that we have feature animals and not children. The only notable exception is my No 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 Day, which is probably all of our favorites books. But my No 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 Day does feature a little girl who's acting up. But most of them have animals. We have a whole bunch of them here. The Kissing Hand is really wonderful book for separation. Healing Days and Maybe Days, one of the really good ones about foster care. The whole series of Feet Are Not for Kicking and Hands Are Not for Hitting and Diapers Are Not Forever, and that whole series. We have all of those. Words Are Not for Hurting. But the ones that are on adoption always feature a little bunny getting adopted by a raccoon family. or that's their version of transracial adoption, but it allows kids to stay in metaphors. And a lot of this you can find on Amazon, or you can get any of these in our clinical library. This one you can only get from us, and this is a very old book. And I know I've showed it to those of you who've been around before. This was written in the 80s, and there's just not a lot about sexual abuse for boys. And we have used this pretty religiously since we found it. I knew it was there because I had it when I was a therapist in the 80s. And I finally found it. I forget, it might have been on eBay. I paid $50 for this little tiny book. It had been in a library someplace, and it was out of print. So we took it over to Office Depot, and they took it apart and bound it for me and made several copies. So, but the reason I always keep it is because there's just not a lot for boys. And we have gotten a lot of disclosures from boys after we read that book. A terrible thing happened. Obviously, the little raccoon is having a terrible day. And he talks about his terrible day and finally gets better. But most of them have to do with animals. Real quick, this is a technique that one of the therapists developed that really is easy to do if you're sitting right in front of them. And the three little hoodlums that destroyed the play therapy room, she did this with them. And so the three of them are sitting there. They were like 3, 4, and 5. They were like staircase kids. But they always acted up. And so she's reading this book to them, and she gave them the Post-it notes and said, now, if I read something on a page and you want to talk about it more, you put a sticky note on it, and then we'll come back. Well, every single page had 3 sticky notes on it. And it wasn't so much that they wanted to talk about what was on the page, but it kept them reading with her, and which kind of was funny. But for kids who had gone from completely destroying a play therapy room to being able to sit in front of Amy while she read this book and be so attentive, they had a job to do. Their job was to put sticky note on, and they did it. Now, a lot of people will use this technique and find it much more successful the way it was meant to be, because a lot of kids will say, yeah, that happened to me. Or, yeah, I want to talk about that because I think, was it Carol? Was it you that told me that you did this and somebody spent a whole lot of time talking about one concept? It might have been. But I do remember you talking.
Yeah, it was like one page was the whole session, because they kept putting sticky notes on all the things that were important to them.
Yeah.
Just on, a page in the book.
Yeah, I do remember you saying that. It's such a simple thing. Some of the things that we do are so simple, and this is why foster parents are looking at it like, what are you doing? So you've got to be able to explain the theory behind this, or they will continue to think that all you're doing is playing. We use storytelling a lot. You can buy these, what do they call it? Rory story cubes. You can buy those on Amazon. You can buy the little blank books in Michael's or the dollar store. The dollar store is a treasure trove of cheap little stuff to use for things like this. And they can fill in their own stories. You can have them tell stories about the little animals, or, I mean, look, what are the best stories in the world? The 3 bears. It's never people, although we get Snow White snuck in there, but we can let kids use their own images for coping, and they don't ever have to say, this is what happened to me. They can have it happen to the raccoon. They can have it happen to, what's the one that we get a lot of? Once I was very scared. If you go onto the playlist, and which playlist is it in? I think it might be in separation, or it might be in foster care. I probably have it in several of them, but it's called Once I Was Very Scared. And it's a whole bunch of little animals sitting around a campfire. And one of them, a little skunk, says, once I was very scared. And she talks about why she was scared. And then the turtle talks about, and then the rabbit. And they all talk about when they were very scared. And then they're able to say, and this is what I did to not be very scared. But they're all animals. So you can find a lot of stuff. If you're not afraid to play, and if you're not afraid to let your imagination go with you, you can do a lot with this kind of stuff. But you have to be comfortable with it too. I cannot say enough about art therapy, mostly because for those of you who don't have a huge play therapy kit with a bunch of stuff, all you need is a piece of paper and whatever medium you want. You can use crayons, you can use markers, you can use pencil, you can use whatever you want. And kids will draw the most amazing things. I think the last training that we have set up for this year at the end is a 6-hour art therapy. It's a PESI training. And the woman is a certified art therapist, but she goes over all kinds of specific art interventions for children who have been traumatized. So it's a really good one. I kind of put it at the end, but because I wanted to look at it, I had bought another one of her particular PESI trainings, and it was more for adults and it wasn't worthwhile for you guys. So I bought this one and vetted it, and I think you'll all get a lot out of it if you like art therapy, because she goes over very specific interventions. But this can be free flow. You can just say, draw me a picture, or you can say, I want you to draw me a house, a tree, a person. It can be all three, it can be one. You can say, I want you to draw me a person picking the apple from the tree. And then you want to see where the person is. Is the person on the ladder getting the apple? Is the person down on the ground and the apples are on the ground and the person can't get to the apples? The house tree person is absolutely the best. It is the easiest one to use, and it is now evidence-based. When I was studying this way back when I was getting my master's, it hadn't gone through an evidence-based thing yet. But now you can buy the book. We have the book here that will tell you how to score it. But you know, you don't even need to score it. Some of the house tree persons are so easy to look at and say, oh, that's what's going on. With a lot of things, you don't necessarily need the manual to figure out what the kid's trying to say. And this was one of the West Coast therapists. This young lady was a banker who decided that she was going to change careers. And this happened to her during one of her therapy sessions, and she got out, came back to the bank and said, I have to send you this picture that this kid just drew for me. She was in the home. It was a 7-year-old boy, and he had been talking on the phone to a father that he didn't know. They were trying to connect him with a dad. The dad didn't even know he had this kid, but he was willing to have phone conversations with him. But sadly, and this happens more than not, we are well-meaning when we try to connect children with parents who didn't know they had them. But very often it doesn't work out. And with this little boy, it didn't work out. He had several phone calls with the dad, and then the dad sort of disappeared. So the therapist is there, the case manager shows up to tell the little boy that he's not going to go live with his dad, which wasn't the textbook way of telling him, but that's what happened. And he drew this picture. And so her name was Amy. Amy asked him, what is in the picture? And he said, well, the blue is the sky. And the black, this is exactly what he said to her. And the black is how my world is now. My heart is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. The square is me, and the holes are my breathing holes, and the yellow is lightning. So here is his heart. His heart is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. This is the smallest heart, and this is him. And I mean, this is a pretty depersonalized kid who is now conceptualizing himself as just breathing. And it was very sad. She was very traumatized by the whole thing. She went back to banking when this was over. She didn't even finish getting her license. She just said, I can't deal with this level of pain with these kids. I'd rather go back and fill out deposit tickets. There's a hard field that we're in. This 7-year-old was in foster care too, and both parents were in jail. And she said, what I think mom loves me, so does dad, but they aren't here with me. Now, it's not too hard to figure out what that is. You don't need to have 4 initials after your name to figure out what this child is thinking. And trying to think of who this was. This is, unfortunately, some of these cases are so sad and so difficult that I have found that we drive people out of the field because there's only so much pain that people can absorb. And this was a young therapist. I was doing her licensure supervision over on the West Coast, and she did wonderful work, but she really burnt out. She had these 2 sisters. They were like, I think they were 7 and 8, and they had been put in an adoptive home with their cousin. The man was their cousin, and he took them in, and then he died unexpectedly of a heart attack. He was only 38 years old. So here's the poor fiance is left with these kids, and she's grieving herself, and she wasn't really sure she wanted to keep them. And they were grieving because their mother had completely disappeared on them. And the father was someplace up in Vermont, and he was abusing drugs and occasionally contacting them. So she just asked them to draw a picture. And the 7-year-old was feeling a little more hopeful than the 8-year-old. But the 7-year-old drew herself, her sisters, pretty much she named all the members of the family. And this was the therapist up here. But she had them on a trampoline. Does anybody have any idea what you might conceptualize of a kid who draws their life on a trampoline? What happens on a trampoline?
It's constantly changing.
Yeah.
Chaos.
Yeah, all of the above. Yeah. It was a very difficult situation. But the thing that I found interesting, number one, is that she did at least put all the people in her life, and she included the therapist. But things were chaotic then. I mean, this guy was only 38 years old. He died unexpectedly. The woman was in shock and grief, but still trying to figure out what to do with these kids. The one I was more concerned about was the 8-year-old, because I think it was the therapist asked her, just draw a picture of your family. That's another instruction you can give them. You can ask them to draw a picture of your family and have everybody doing something. Those are really great because then everybody's doing something. But she drew, these are all the people that she perceived to be in her family, but are they doing anything together? They're just all lined up in space, and they're just all walking, and they're not even looking at each other. They're all walking, looking away from each other. They're disconnected. And she was feeling incredibly disconnected. The happy ending to this story, since there are occasionally a few happy endings to our work, is that we finally got the foster mom or the adoptive mom into a grief group. We got the kids into a grief group, and we continued with therapy. Eventually, it took a while. Grief is not something you can rush. So it took several months. Eventually, the adoption went through, and it has been successful. But had we pushed the adoption at this stage, it would not have been successful. If I had asked the mother to draw a picture, I think she would have drawn something very similar to this, because they were all completely disconnected from each other. I'm going to show you this one. This is a technique called Wall Around the Heart. And this is on our YouTube channel. If you pull the playlist for therapeutic interventions, Wall Around the Heart is on there. This was an actual client who drew Wall Around the Heart. He was in an adoptive home. I believe he was 11, and he had been placed as a young child. And the instruction with Wall Around the Heart, and again, you can watch it on YouTube, it's like 10 minutes long, is to draw she asked, his name was John, draw yourself the day you're born. And he drew himself. At that point, he saw himself as not having been damaged. She said, draw yourself when you think the very first abuse event happened. And in his mind, he thought it happened when he was 19 months old, which is probably what he had been told. because he had been adopted at a young age. And when he drew his heart this time, he drew a jagged line through it. And then he was asked to draw his heart now. And he drew the heart, he drew the jagged, and then he drew a wall around it. When he first drew it, he was going to connect the dots, but then he opened up the heart. This is a very defended wall. But what this particular therapist, her process part of this exercise was to say, okay, when you were 1 year old, or when you were 1 day old, there's your heart. It wasn't damaged, nobody had hurt it, and you were capable of love. And then in your mind, when you were 19 months old and you were hurt, then you did not think that you could be loved. So when you went to live with your parents, from whom he was really disconnected, you went to live with your parents and you felt that even though your heart was bigger, it was more damaged. So you drew this wall around it, but you left a way for them to get in. And that was how she processed that with him. And again, I would have to say that we ended up having some success with that adoption. But sometimes, I guess that what I want you to see is that visually, this was a visual for John. He could see that this is why he felt hurt, and this is why he felt like he had to defend himself. And all you need for that is a piece of paper and some crayons. All right, Kathy Melchiati, this is where I got the post-traumatic toxic play and dynamic play. And if you're interested in that, just let me know. This is our book. Carol, I think you have one of these in your office too, for the house tree person. This is how you can score. But honest to God, you don't need to score it. It's really easy to figure this one out. But if you want to have proof positive and you want to use it, it has a score. I don't know that you have all the score sheets. I think you've got the book, but you can go ahead and score it, and then you can see exactly where you are with this. But most kids will draw something very, very specific. And I just want to see what time I have here. Okay, I'm going to show you. I can't show you all of them. I don't have time. I'm going to show you the pictorial timeline, because the pictorial timeline is super easy to do too. And again, all you need is a piece of paper and some drawing material. And this is also on our YouTube channel.
Hi, I'm Amy Iannatelli, Executive Director of Circle of Friends Services. We provide in-home counseling services to children and families in the child welfare system. We specialize in trauma, and this is one of the play therapy interventions that we use with our kids. So today I'm going to demonstrate a play therapy intervention. It's a creative intervention that we use called the pictorial timeline. And this will help children to explore their trauma narrative, explore what has happened to them, but in a playful and non-directive way, so that they can use pictures to show what's happened to them instead of using words and having to verbalize what has happened. So the first thing you want to do for this activity is you want to draw the line, the actual timeline, beginning with when they were born and ending with their current age. So I'm going to do that now. And we're going to pretend that this child is 10 years old. So we put 0 to 10. Now, the next thing I do when I'm meeting with a child is I'll explain that we're going to fill in significant things that have happened to him or her at various ages. And they don't have to remember everything. They don't have to know the exact age that they were. It's okay to take their best guess. They can include their family members. I've been in homes where they want to include mom and say, hey mom, when did this happen to me? Or when did I change schools? And then that will invite the parent to be involved in this process. And that's okay. That's really a good thing. It's really up to the child and the family and your clinical decision on who needs to be included in this session. So again, just reinforce with the child and family that this does not have to be perfect and they do not have to be a good artist. They can really just do the best that they can. So the next thing I do with them is I will go through, I have a list, which we will share with you at the end of this video, of significant events that have happened to children and how we're going to represent them with a picture. So the first thing on my list that I have, and I will say this to a child, can you please draw some blocks when you first started school? So the child will maybe say, okay. At age 5, I started a new school. So probably when he went to kindergarten. And these are some blocks. Then the next one is I'll say, if you had a new baby born into your family, draw when that happened. And again, you don't have to stick to black. I let kids choose whatever color they want to do. So we're going to choose blue. And we're going to say that maybe at 4, they had a new baby born. Now, there's a whole bunch of these, probably about 15 different events. Not all of them will apply. You can go through each one and see if that applies to them. If you know it doesn't, you can skip it. If they would like to fill in any other ones that you didn't describe, that's allowed too. I'm going to do one more, and then we're going to talk about how to process this event. The next one can be joined a team, club, or organization. That's a positive event. We want to include both. So maybe at 6 years old, they joined a team or a club that they felt really good about. Okay. So you would go through the whole series until they're done. And then I'm going to show you what that might look like. So here's one that's much more filled out. And I'm going to point out what some of these mean for you. Triangle represents that the client went into foster care. A house represents that they moved. The 3 bars represents that a family member went to jail. A sad face represents that the child witnessed family violence. This is a pill bottle that is crossed out, meaning they had a family member go receive substance abuse treatment. This is a gravestone representing that a child had a death in the family. So again, we're going to include all these symbols for you on a separate slide at the end of the video, so you'll have that information to do this yourself. But once it's all done, you can see that it represents visually for you what's going on with this child, and they get to have that insight as well. So for this particular child, you can see a lot of stuff what was happening at age 9. And really, this is a lot of trauma. So not only was he put into foster care, but then a lot of changes happened. He changed schools, he moved, he witnessed family violence. This is a lot. And sometimes the clients might not even have the insight to know that a lot had happened in a very short amount of time. So as a therapist, this gives you opportunity to help the client gain insight, to express their feelings about things, to start the trauma narrative in a really safe way. And the therapist can validate their feelings, validate how scary things might have been, invalidate some accomplishments that they've had in the past and their strengths. It also gives the therapist an opportunity to get rid of faulty thinking. You know, the child might say, you know, well, this was my fault. And you get opportunity to say, this was not your fault. And you can talk about adults' job to keep them safe. So instead of having a very difficult conversation, this becomes a whole lot easier through the use of play and art and a medium that's a lot more comfortable for children. So again, I'm going to include the instructions and all the symbols for you on a separate slide right after this video, with also my contact information if you have any questions. So good luck to you, and thanks for watching this play therapy intervention.
Okay, if anybody wants that pictorial timeline, I can send it to you. It's kind of hard to see it on there, but we also were a little bit more crazy in the beginning with our production music. That was 2017. We've calmed down quite a bit since then. We don't do all that, but we don't have time to watch Goodnight Yoga, but it's on it's on our YouTube channel. And if you want anything to calm a child down at the beginning or an end of a session, that's the ticket. Music, you know, again, a lot of what I've seen, the therapists can be quite creative about the way they use music. I had one therapist who had a little music playlist on her tablet, and she had certain kids would pick certain, that was the beginning of the session or the end of the session, and she would have them compare it with some kind of a relaxation activity, maybe a little yoga thing or whatever. But you can be as creative as you want and how you deal with music. I don't think that Carol or Lisa or myself put a whole lot of parameters around what you do. If what you're doing is to pair the activity with something that's relaxing, that's helpful for kids. And that's what music is for a lot of us. And lastly, let's go over sand tray a little bit, because now that you're getting back out to being in people's homes or being in person, sand tray is a great activity. I was actually telling somebody who uses the room here that I'm going to bring the sand tray back out for our play therapy room, because we just had it in the closet for a while. But it's a wonderful activity for a lot of reasons. For one thing, it's very sensory. So just running your fingers through sand is a calming experience for a lot of kids. But it allows them to tell a story in a very non-threatening, metaphorical way. And they don't have to have the words. They can create in the sand whatever world that they want to create. And usually the message you're going to give them is you have the sand tray, and we have portable sand trays. Amy and I used to make them and sell them all the time at cost so that people would have one for their trunk. But it was really just a sand tray, a Tupperware sand tray, and a bag of starter kit. And again, you can look on the YouTube channel. It'll tell you how to build the sand tray, what you need to have for the kit, what you need to have for the bag. And you don't have to have a lot in the beginning, but it does just give clients a safe way to tell their story. And they can be in control of how they're telling the story. And all you're really saying to them is, I want you to build a world in the sand for me. They can tell you what's in the sand. They can tell you the story, or they cannot tell you the story, but they can build the story in the sand. And remember when I was telling you before about the kid that was always burying the baby, that was toxic play for a while. We had to kind of get him out of that. This was a 4-year-old. He had been reunified with his parents. And when we do this, we're looking for certain things, and we're asking people, what's in your story? Can you tell me a little bit about the story? You don't have to say, is this you? Is this your story? Is this your family? But tell me what you just built in the sand. In this particular case, this was a little guy who had just gone home, and he verbalized that I'm safe at home with my parents, and there are lots of trees. In this little boy's mind, trees were protective. And he said that. And he wasn't even in the sand. Actually, I think he was sitting on his rug. And he was able to say, okay, I feel safe now. I'm back home. And this is me. This is dad. This is mom. He said that. You don't have to say it. You can let the child tell you what he thinks is in his story. This was an 8-year-old boy. He was living in a multi-generational family, and they were all fighting with each other. And in the beginning, when Toys R Us was still around, we had kits that we could buy that had volcanoes in them. I can't buy the volcanoes now. I haven't been able to find a source for them, but volcanoes were always a good symbol. Kids would use volcanoes to they always used them to signify conflict. And that this volcano was going to erupt. The kid would always say, I'm putting the volcano there, it's going to go up. Or we put all these soldiers around to protect the volcano, protect us from the volcano. So he talked about the fact that he was able to identify, this is my family, and they're all fighting all the time. And that was really why he was with us. And this is a really good, I know it's confusing to look at it. When you do sand tray, you always want to wait till they're done and then say, is it okay if I take a picture now? And no, you can't be in the picture. I just want to take a picture of your sand tray. Now, why do we do that? We do that to say, I'm going to take your sand tray apart, but let's take a picture of it so that we have a record of what you did. This particular little boy, we just could not get him out of the picture no matter what we did. So we had to kind of try to Photoshop him out. But the reason I wanted to use it is that he was a very damaged child. And this is the baby. The baby is in the middle. And he had all of these, he identified all of these figures around him as threatening figures. The lion, the horse, there's a lot of soldiers, they're all around him. And when you're letting people process their sand tray, you let them tell you what the figures are. Because for some, the lion might have been a protective figure. For some, the horse might have been a protective figure. What this little boy said was he was a victim of sexual trauma. He disclosed after we read It Happens to Boys Too at one of their group sessions. And CPI was called, mother denied, said it didn't happen, the case wasn't verified. And after that happened, this little boy just wouldn't talk at all. He wouldn't talk about his sexual trauma history. He was defecating into Ziploc bags and hiding them in drawers, although they weren't hiding because the smell was dreadful. But he built the sand tray, and the therapist called me and said, can I bring the picture over to you, even though we couldn't get his face out of it? And I said, well, what did he say? And she said, he said to me, the baby's in the middle and nobody is protecting the baby. All of these figures are trying to get the baby. And it is hard to see. I think this came from Toys of the Trade, because this was a guy with a weapon in his hand. And some of the more extreme figures come from Toys of the Trade. But you could also buy buckets full of soldiers at Toys R Us. You could buy buckets full of dinosaurs at Toys R Us. It was easy to get the stuff before they went out of business. But what he said was, no one is protecting the baby. The baby's in the middle and nobody is protecting the baby. That was after we were not able to verify his sexual trauma. This was pretty much the closest he came to talking about it. Hold on. However, a month later, he did the same thing. He built a sand tray again. And this time it was a little female figure. around it. And he had all of these aggressive figures around it and said, basically, somebody needs to come in and rescue the lady. Somebody needs to fix her. Now, what we looked at with him, because this ended up to be a successful adoption. This kid did leave. He went on to be adopted. It's always good to know that there's a successful ending. But what we were looking at with this is that he was beginning to get adaptive outcomes. He was beginning to see, okay, here the baby is in the middle and nobody is protecting the baby. All of these people are around the baby and nobody's protecting the baby. By this time, a month later, he began to say, maybe somebody needs to come in. Maybe somebody will rescue the baby. So we were feeling like he was on the right track with that. And this is the last one I'm going to show you, but this would, I show this because you don't have to be terribly skilled to do this. I had done a training on sand tray and everybody left with their little sand tray kit. And this therapist went back to her office and had the little sand tray kit and the starter kit, put it on the floor of her office. And this little girl had just been admitted that day. Her name was Faith. And she came in and saw the kit with the plastic bag and said, can I play with this? And the therapist said, sure. So Faith built this little thing. She had a volcano. I wish I could make this bigger, but this is a baby. There's a baby. And there is, it was a soldier figure. And these were little fences, which usually would signify some kind of protective element. But in this particular picture, she had the baby, she had the soldier laying on the baby. And the therapist looked down, I think she was doing her notes or something, and said, what's going on here? And she said to the therapist, the perpetrator is on the baby. And the therapist said, what? And she said, the perpetrator is on the baby. So when the therapist said, well, do you want to talk to me about it? She said, no. And this little girl had not come in for sexual trauma. We didn't know she was a victim of sexual trauma. We didn't really verify that she was until she had an outbreak of genital herpes. And then she had herpes on her mouth, she had herpes on her genitals. And at that point, the treatment, and we were able to notify the abuse hotline, and it turned out to be the mother's boyfriend was the suspected perpetrator. But I mean, that was a sand tray that the kid built, and the therapist had absolutely no skill in doing it. So sometimes kids will just lead their own way, and maybe we should let them. So what I would say to you guys is that in closing, and everybody always likes to get to the slide where I say in closing, we have to recognize that trauma is affecting our kids. The kids that we're working with have been affected by trauma. Their brains have been shaped by trauma. Their skill levels on certain things have been affected by trauma, but the trauma can be remediated. The reason that we try so hard to help you guys to learn how to effectively use play therapy and expressive therapies is that by and large, we're working with younger children, and by and large, these are kids that are not going to sit down and say, let me tell you what happened to me. So they might after all this is over, but they don't usually do it in the beginning. So know what you're doing, know what your theory is about what you're doing. And then I think the best thing I can say is trust the process, because play therapy and expressive therapies do work. You do need to work with your program managers to say, should I be moving this kid along? Is this kid stuck in toxic play? Should this kid be moving along? It's not something you just let happen. You do need to work with them. And it is a skill. And it's a skill that I think that our therapists really do have. So, but I think what we just want you all to know is that this does get better. You guys can make this better and have made it better. So let me. Okay. Anybody have any comments? I see there's some stuff in the chat. Let me just make sure there's nothing I need to address here. No, I saw you come back in. Okay, if anybody, some of you probably already have, some of you already have the toxic and dynamic play. Some of you already have the pictorial timeline. If anybody wants it, do not hesitate to just shoot me an email and I'll send it out. Happy to have the GALs. Anytime you guys want to come, you're more than welcome to come. We have to all work together doing the same crazy work, and the more we can do together, the better off we are. Anybody have anything that they want to add to this party before we shut down?
Yes, Barbara, when you were talking about CBHAs and not knowing the child, sometimes when the child comes in and maybe the information's not in the CBHA, that's why I said you're always welcome to reach out to at least the Seminole County Guardian Ad Litem office, and we are happy to clue you in on what we know of the child as you begin therapy with that child.
I appreciate that. You know, I've known Sandy for a long time, and she's always been extremely cooperative with our people, and I appreciate that because it isn't always a seamless partnership, but with you guys it is. So we appreciate you, and anytime you want to join us, you're more than welcome.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated attending today. So I'm so glad that you're allowing us to come in and do this.
Oh, no problem. You know, I have Sandy on, we send out a Thursday email every Thursday that has our trainings. And I always have Sandy on that mailing list, but I can have Daisy, who does it, now I have your emails. So I'll have her put you guys on that mailing list as well.
Thank you so much.
All right, my people, anything? All right, let me stop the recording.